Why the hell does the Google 6's front-facing camera look a heck of a lot better than Logitech's top-tier $200 webcam? What the hell? Let's get right into the game dev news. So we're trying to expand on the basic mechanics of the game, which is pretty much exploration and learning about the world around you. I've implemented a new tool in the player's inventory, which is an environmental scanner. This tool is used to send out a pulse, which effectively collides with surrounding objects. And if those objects happen to contain a tiny collidable node containing a small piece of text, a piece of information about that object, it will appear on the screen, which then allows the player to walk up to it, analyze it, and read the information about the item, which is phrased in a way an AI is attempting to identify the possible purpose of a prop in front of you. Now, the origin of this idea was the fact that since this is a ship of inhuman nature, the technology might actually be so foreign that the player might even not understand what everything is meant for. So what I figured we could do is, either we decide to design a lot of the props to have some sort of a human counterpart resemblance, like if there's a oven or a toaster, then we would basically design a alien space oven or space toaster to look like a human one, or more or less. And then the player can kind of put two and two together and know what the item is without needing a description. That would be one way to do it. But if we wanted to have something more whimsical, something more futuristic, then there isn't really a heck of a lot of modern counterpart that we could use to let the player put two and two together, in which case the player could learn about objects using these little notes. And on top of that, another application of this is a way of delivering lore and background information, including individual character and civilization history, and any concurrent quest narratives that the player might be following. The fact that this information is given through a small analysis tool kind of gamifies the process of learning about the world and give me an outlet to provide a potentially immense amount of background information in order to enrich the world that the player finds themselves in. After all, if you want the player to connect with a character or a particular group of people in your game, you have to make the player learn a veritable amount of information about the subject, like their behaviors, their traditions, their conflicts, and their sacrifices. And because the player would be learning about the civilization that has been dead for many thousands of years, the most optimal way to do it is through either flashbacks, props, or environmental storytelling. Now, whenever I can remember, I try to squeeze out as much use out of a particular mechanic as I can so that I don't end up with one-trick pony systems. And another benefit of this environmental scanner is that anytime the player scans a literal piece of text, they're going to receive a single decryption node, which they can use to make their tablet decrypting minigame a little bit easier. Think of them as hacking nodes in BioShock. You could either go through the trouble of hacking a turret or a camera or another device manually, but then if you don't manage it, you risk getting electrocuted or even killed or alerting the nearby NPCs, or you can use a previously gathered hacking tool and bypass that whole problem. Now, in this case, the decryption nodes don't outright grant you access to a tablet. Instead, what they do is they eliminate some of the incorrect answers or incorrect nodes so that you have a much easier time decrypting a tablet and reading the information on it. A giant core part of this game is the player learning about what happened to this vessel. And the major part of the player's ability to progress forward is their ability to find clues within the conversations in these tablets. So what I'm hoping this will do is motivate the player to actively seek out any written pieces of text to decrypt and receive these decryption nodes in order for them to make their life easier when they need to decrypt a tablet. And because the players are actively seeking out these written pieces of data, they will most likely inevitably read them anyways and learn something about the civilization in the process one way or another. periodically I try to not lose the sense of what kind of atmosphere or kind of environment you were supposed to be submerged in. So what I've done here is decided to set up a very quick area node triggerable soundtrack switcher, which effectively detects when the player enters it and it switches the soundtrack to a different piece of music. I've written a few very loosely cobbled together atmospheric pieces which are mostly soundscapes and place them into the level so they get triggered whenever the game runs. It honestly really helps to not lose sight of what the game is about and what the core of the experience you're trying to build when you make it easy for yourself to get immersed into the environment. And for me, music especially, music and sound effects, play a humongous role in making sure that the experience I'm playing is actually rooted. Especially since it's very easy to lose sight of what it is that I'm even making, I find that placing even a very quickly put together soundtrack really helps to remind myself of what I'm building here. Okay. Interesting. Man. Of course, traditionally, between the mechanics, I also do a bunch of modeling to try to make sure that the visual presentation of this game more or less matches what it is that I'm envisioning. I don't mind doing concept art and then offloading the 3D modeling onto one of our team members, but I like 3D modeling myself still. I by no means find the process to be a chore. So I had an idea for a prop that might explain how this civilization was surviving in outer space in this vessel, and the idea was to create a plant pot that looked a little bit unusual. It was a vertically oriented plant pot that mostly contained vine-like plants, and the player would be able to scan this with the scanner and get some information about what kind of purpose this particular prop had on this vessel. It's not really a requirement for every game out there to in detail explain what every object does, but I feel like maybe this would be the kind of game that did it. I also ended up scouting around for a placeholder sound effect for the scanner because I really wanted to have something in place instead of silence, as well, again, it really helps with immersion. I could technically work with silence and no sound effects, but it honestly really helps with not losing sight if your world is actually responding to what you're doing. I found a nice little ping sound that actually, like both I and the audio engineer ended up liking, so I think we're just gonna keep using that one. I mean, again, that's Zapsplat for you. They really offer a huge selection of sounds that can work right out of the box. You hear that, Zapsplat? You better get those affiliate links ready. I can't recommend you enough. I also figured it might be a good idea to have some variation here, so I ended up just nuking lower half of this object and making almost like a secondary shelf plot for additional plants. The way I see it, botany will have been a major part of this civilization's history, so there will be a lot of plant-themed objects and props scattered throughout this vessel. And I hope that the strange look of these props would make the process of exploring this vessel a lot more whimsical, and it would force the players to raise questions about what was all of this meant for. I played around a bit with arranging these props in an interesting pattern. These could technically be used to create labyrinths or maze-like level layouts. Not to mention that the player can easily reach the tops of these units with using their jetpack, so this could also be used for some platforming action. Next feature I got to work on was one of the basic features I've laid down in the to-do list early on, which is the drone's ability to pull on certain props in order for you to interact with the environment, maybe pull some blocks out of the way, break some hatches open, essentially grant you access to certain areas, get into tight squeezes, and interact with control panels that are out of reach of the player. The very first occurrence of this mechanic is actually one that takes place in this pseudo-tutorial fashion, where the player has to use the drone in order to pull out one of the visibly broken large colossal doors off of its hinges in order to gain access to the inside of the vessel. Now, we already have the ability to spawn and control the drones using the little TV drone controller, but additional features have to be added. Like, for example, the drone should be the only one that can see points of attachment, so hinges. These would technically be represented as red bars that the drone can target using its grapple. Now, these red bars would also have a dedicated icon that can only be visible by the drones, so I had to make sure that that icon can be drawn solely within the drone camera viewport. Of course, along with being able to see any object you can tether with the grappling hook, I also had to somehow make the drone figure out which object it is actually supposed to be targeting. Now, this was actually achieved by taking a look at the list of icons that are showing up within the camera's viewport. There would be one icon for each grappleable object, and simply figuring out which one of those objects is the closest to the center of the drone, which actually also meant that I had to establish where the center of the drone is. So what I've done is essentially overlaid a little label, kind of like a vertical and horizontal cross lines, where the two lines met represented the center of the camera view. So that became the point against which I compared the distances to each and every icon, and of course each and every icon also within itself stored a reference to which grappling attachment node it represented. So all I had to do is just tell the drone to take a look at which icon has lit up, get the attachment node from there, and attach the grappling line to whatever object it represented. Since the grappling hook at the moment is just a straight line, I simply used a CSG box and stretched it between the drone starting point and the grappling hook ending point. After that, it was just a simple fact of calculating some transforms. Now, I say simple, but I took a few moments to try to figure out how to do it. There was a lot of very awkward angles and very sideways grappling lines, but eventually we got it to work just fine. So this grappling hook is supposed to be attached to a little handle or some sort of a marked object, and by pulling the drone backwards, the player will be able to break open the door. Now, this is something that's going to be granted to the player after he completes a set number of objectives. As soon as they land on this vessel, the player has to do a little bit of exploration, they have to discover some notes, they have to get into a little bit of the lore, we have to raise some stakes, we have to increase tensions, we have to intrigue the player to want to enter into this vessel. So there's going to be a bit of exposition, a bit of narrative priming that the player has to discover before they are granted access to drones and the ability to pull the door off the hinges. Now, the way I figured I can achieve the effect of the door being pulled off of its place was by pre-fracturing the door mesh in Blender into dozens and dozens of little chunks, and then when the drone attaches itself to one of the chunks and then backs up, the chunks would kind of implode. It would make the door fracture inwards into the stargazing room. Now, I ended up with about maybe 30 chunks, and there was no way in hell I was going to hand animate each and every single one of them. So at this point, what I've done is I've used Bezier curves, the curve texture resource, which is a resource that comes with Godot Engine, and I've used this texture by building an interpolation curve that effectively took the distance between the chunk and the center of the point where the drone was attaching itself, and figuring out how far the chunk of the door would be flung from its epicenter when the door would actually break, which means that all the chunks don't fly off all at the same speed. The chunks that were closer to the drone's grappling hook attachment point would be the ones to fly off further than, let's say, the chunks that are located in the periphery. And of course, I'm a lazy ass. I don't want to hand program each and every chunk, so most of this movement had been done in a parent node. It would simply talk to each and every child and advanced its transition by every frame. And of course, each and every chunk was actually just exported out of Blender as a GLTF file, which means each and every object retained its individual node structure. I was also able to grant each and every node its own collision shape, because in Blender, if you name an object with a -call suffix, then when you export in GLTF format, Godot Engine actually automatically generates a collision shape for that object, which means the player with his jetpack ability can jump around on these chunks instead of, phasing through, which would usually be interpreted as a bug or a glitch. So in the end, pre-fracturing objects, exporting them as GLTF, and just looping the list of children is a very quick way to establish some really cool crumbling effects. As a matter of fact, I reused this approach when I did something later with a crumbling pillar, which you will see later on in the video. It was a good starting point, but I still find it to be more of a placeholder effect. You can also see here that I'm actually fracturing the entire array of doors instead of just one door, and the original reason for this was that so that the player has a very clear view of the little scout jump ship that they flew in on when the player is traversing the inner space of this temple region. Later on, however, I figured that maybe instead of having all of the doors crumble, I should just let one door crumble, and when the player reaches a certain point in the game when they start finagling with the ship and bringing it back online, the ship would automatically just pull all the other doors open as if it was intending to open up the passage to the stargazing area, thus clearing the view with a lot less debris flying around and achieving the same exact effect of the player having a very clear view of the scout ship. And it is important for the player to have a clear view of the scout ship because of a certain scripted event that happens later in the story. Before moving on, there was one final component to set up, and it is the fact that the first time the player uses the grappling hook on the door, the grappling hook is supposed to fly off, detach, and hit the drone, destroying it in the process. And the reason being is because the player isn't supposed to have too many drones to explore high places too early on in the game. As a matter of fact, the whole idea is to give the player a fairly limited range of movement in the beginning so that they would discover a couple of locations they would want to visit, and then grant the player access to the jetpack, which drastically expands their range of movement, allowing them to reach new spaces. I just wanted to make sure that the player wouldn't ruin their ability to discover certain locations in person by simply flying to those locations with a drone, which of course has a much less impressive way of peeking into certain locations. So the player would learn how to use the drones early on, but acquire free range of usage for the drones a little bit later in the story once they get free access to roam the level. So I had quickly put together a 3D mesh of the snapped rope, and to pull off the effect, I simply scaled the rope across technically the Z-axis to make it look like it's flying straight into the camera of the drone, upon which it would just destroy itself and create some sparks. Next, I wanted to present the reason I started recording OBS twice, one in MKV format and one in MP4 format. What you see in front of you is a corrupted video file for me modeling a little data tablet for the NPC. This is an NPC exclusive prop, and I made the NPC hold it and read it and kind of move around a little. Thankfully, there wasn't really any coding involved, so we really only lost the animating process, but this could have happened on a programming video. And this issue, this corrupted MP4 file, is exactly the reason why I hate using MP4 video for recording. All of you old farts in the industry can go eat a lemon. MP4 sucks, right? It sucks. Use MKV as an industry standard. I swear to God. MKV format is so robust, you can detonate a nuclear missile right next to the computer and it will be perfectly fine. You can open it, you can read it, you can edit it. It just works. The problem is that a lot of video editors don't want to support it. In the meantime, the one format they do support is the one that literally shits its pants the moment you look at it funny, which is, of course, what you see in front of you. Look at that mess. That's terrible. And judging by the timestamps of my backups, I think this episode here was recorded literally days before I started using a dual recording setup, by recording MP4 for easy editing and MKV in case of crap like this happens. Literally days before I implemented that system. So yeah, this particular file is lost, but thankfully most of it was pretty much just animation. So funny enough, the reason I needed this animation is because we were actually starting to get into the realm of executing the narrative, being able to talk to this NPC and proceed with getting quests, asking questions, getting additional information, doing all sorts of story-based gameplay. So this was about time I started setting up the dialogue for this NPC, and of course I'm using my homegrown dialogue builder available on the conceptbay.net website by the name of Dialogi. You guys might have seen a couple of other episodes where I start using this tool. This is my all-around dialogue handling dialogue builder tool, which I am using across multiple of my projects. It allows me to set up things like dialogue trees, options, choices, choosing which dialogue to talk about or which subject to discuss, granting quests, granting tasks to those quests, checking if certain criteria have been matched, like flags or items in the inventory. Generally, all the stuff that you would expect to see in an RPG game. It's all done using dictionaries and JSON files. So I had gone ahead and established the dialogue that we would have as soon as we land on the vessel, which of course included us exchanging some hurtful words and then receiving a quest to explore the immediate area. This dialogue and quest system would pretty much be the core of keeping track of what objectives the player has. And a lot of the side narratives that the player discovers throughout the vessel would indeed show up as quests in their journal, which would allow the player to keep track of where in the story they are currently located and how much of it they have already discovered. Now, it was around this time when I started looking around at the immediate area where the player lands, and I figured that this half helmet looking like this looks literally the inside of a helmet right now. I was not really satisfied with the way this was looking. This didn't really seem like an interesting place to explore, and it also didn't really look like there was enough space for us to fit, an explorable location. And it was around this time when I got an idea for a segment called the Stargazing Room. It was the place where the player and the NPC land and start exploring, start executing their quest, and it was also a place where the player would be primed for their entry into the main vessel, into the temple. It would be the place where they would find some notes, which would attempt to lay down some intrigue about what is inside of this vessel, about some sort of a significant colossal event, something that would spark curiosity in the player and drive the desire to finally enter into the main vessel. The stargazing room was also supposed to have been a chunk of the original world of this civilization. Because their home world is no more, this was essentially the last place where everybody had collected all of their dear belongings that reminded them of home, and they have established this collective room called the stargazing room, within which they could come in and reminisce on their lost world, and it would essentially be presented as a colossal botanical garden which used the soil from their original home world. And of course that motivated the need to expand the region into a more substantial chunk of space. I ended up going with a long horizontal, almost like a greenhouse look. The Blender's wireframe modifiers had definitely come in handy here. In the good old fashion of RPG games, even though this isn't really an RPG game, but I kind of want to have some of the elements, we gotta have a quest acquisition pop-up screen. The big fat letters that appear to the side of the screen officially indicating that you have just acquired a quest. This pop-up is honestly a personal preference. I myself just like the way they look. They look very official. They very clearly indicate that you have a quest now. Good job. Now go do it. Even though technically this isn't an RPG game. It's also a very easy way to easily guide the player to what they're supposed to be doing right now. So if they spend a lot of time exploring the environment, they don't lose track of what they were supposed to do. They can just open up the pop-up with the journal and it'll tell you, you're on this quest, you're supposed to do this, 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 and this. This will pop up on the screen anytime the player talks to the NPC and the NPC gives them a quest, as well as anytime a quest is completed or a particular task is reached. To switch gears a little bit, I decided to do some concept art work. These were effectively a set of props for the stargazing area, which includes social gathering themes. There was a mural, which would usually be found in a temple area. The mural depicts an image or a photograph of a particular significant figure, as well as their immediate ancestry, so their parental units, so to speak. I thought it would be a nice addition to the culture of the species. They immortalize the achievements of significant figures in their nation by respecting the parents who have produced such a useful member of their society. This concept art piece included a couple of components that could be used in context together or individually, and there were basically a mural, a candle holder, a praying mat, and particularly shaped multi-candle stand. After this, another piece of concept art I produced is that pertaining to social gathering props, which usually includes this round table, which is indicative of them valuing facing each other in a conversation or social gathering, as well as various picnic paraphernalia. For the most part, it's cups, heating elements, the brewing kettle for brewing various teas, plates, cups, and various silverware. Except none of it is made out of silver, so I guess I would probably say this would be stoneware. It was around this time when I got into contact with a concept artist from Mexico, looking into helping us out with some of the prop designs, because I have been thoroughly swamped with programming and 3D modeling of my own, and since we have also a 3D modeler helping us out, producing concept art while I'm already flooded with all the programming, 3D modeling, and all the other stuff has become kind of an overbearing problem. Plus, I think it would be a good idea to have some external contribution to the design of the aesthetic. So what I've been doing here is try to prepare some ideas of my own interpretation for costumes that the alien civilization will wear based on their duty on the vessel. Between working on exteriors, interiors, being the ship navigators, technicians, scientists, researchers, teachers, religious figures, all of them would probably have some sort of a unique type of a uniform, and being able to encounter that uniform throughout the world might enrich the player's perception of that world. I've also been realizing that the current scale of the temple zone might actually not be sufficient enough to provide enough space for the various locations that the player would encounter. There's supposed to be a school to bring up the younglings. There's supposed to be a community center. There's supposed to be an initiation temple where the younglings go through a ritual of maturity. They are assigned a role. They go through a ritual of their spiritual beliefs. There's supposed to be an entire suspended temple hanging off the rooftops, and the current scale of the temple zone is just not big enough to fit that entire space. Now, luckily, because of the game's lean on verticality, all we have to really do is to expand the ceiling level and to push the outermost wall of the outer region of the vessel out just a little bit. And that would grant us all the additional space we would need to fit just about anything within the confines of the temple zone. In an attempt to identify the general architectural shapes that this civilization will be using for their buildings, I tried to pluck down some very quick shape ideas. For the most part, I tried doodling down some meshes of different shapes together, but then I decided that it's probably going to be faster to do the same exact thing using Blender shapes. So I did the rest of the experiments in 3D. This was mainly to try and hone down on the general silhouette of an average building found within this vessel. There's got to be some sort of a trending base shape that is found within any civilization, be it sphere-based, crystal-based, could be fully rectangular. There just has to be somewhat of a foundation that all the buildings are rooted in. To keep things moving, if I don't get any ideas in one particular zone, I'll just move on to another one and see what we come up with here. With the stargazing zone, I realized that there's a whole bunch of horizontal flat space and not a whole lot of ideas of what to populate that space with. Not only that, there's a whole bunch of vertical space that is being virtually unused at this moment, so I decided to place a small greenhouse, a self-contained greenhouse within the upper region of the stargazing room, and that actually gave me an idea for a really cool quest, a side quest that the player would be able to undertake. It's essentially a side quest of the botanist, the lead botanist who was running the stargazing room and the greenhouse. Her belief was that the whole quest this entire vessel was basically just a waste of time, and it was going to be practically the end of their civilization. It was a wild goose chase. So she had dedicated her whole life in trying to keep the last vestige of their civilization alive, and that mostly meant the original plants and seeds that came from their home planet to grow and prosper within that little greenhouse. So that greenhouse is actually going to be the only place that still has surviving plants from the original world. And this botanist's dream would be to detach this greenhouse, this little slice of heaven, from the entire vessel and then send it off on its own into outer space to try to save what remained of her home planet. So this is going to be one of the side quests where the player first discovers notes and conversations and the conflict that this botanist had to go through to try to realize her dream. And of course, she won't be successful at realizing her dream, and that gives the player the ability to finish that dream for her, thus, of course, creating the gaming content for this little space adventure. The player will chronologically discover the botanist's story as it unfolds technically in the past, but in the same order that it happened, through found messages, found conversations, tablets, evidence, and environmental storytelling, and come to a conclusion that in order for the player to progress forward with the main quest. For example, acquire some vital component that is needed to progress the story forward, the player has to finish the side quest to do so. Which technically, if the side quest is required to finish the main quest, then technically this would be a part of the main quest. The whole definition of a side quest is that it's optional. While I was busy with that, I received the first contribution from our concept artist, which was a set of silhouettes for various components we could place into the game. This mainly contained a list of murals, structures, and obelisks, and you would be surprised how far along a simple silhouette could get you. Your mind tends to fill in the blanks when it's given a little bit of context, so even looking at the silhouettes, I could already come up with some very interesting props. And that's kind of a weird approach to it, coming up with props from silhouettes rather than coming up with props and then making silhouettes for those props. This happens to me a lot with music. When I am writing music, I do a lot of searching and scavenging for interesting soundscapes and instruments among my library of sound effects, and very often I would stumble upon some very interesting sound that would spawn an idea for a level or an idea for a prop or some sort of a segment in the game, where usually the opposite takes place. If you're working as a, let's say, composer or sound engineer in the studio, you would receive a list of props, objects, levels, and other events that need to have sound effects made for them. And generally, there's very little wiggle room that you would get between all of those components. If you're in a good team, you could propose some ideas and have those ideas be implemented into the game, or at least considered for implementation. But for the most part, with large studios, you just get a list of sounds you gotta make, and that's basically your entire job. So I gotta say, even something as simple as the silhouettes was already giving me some really interesting ideas. So I've gone ahead and picked this obelisk object, which would be placed at the back of the stargazing room and have some piece of history outlined on it as readable text. My next revision to the stargazing room was to add some divisions along the length of the whole room, because one single flat shape was just being far too boring of an experience. So I wanted to add some verticality, maybe some levels that the player could traverse upwards. This would also break the line of sight with certain objects, so you could have the opportunity to discover something new only when you reach a particular zone or particular level. So I've divided this into 3 segments, with the top segment being the largest one, and essentially this would give us small segments of the garden within which we can position a small set of puzzles for the player to finish. And because we have divided it and extruded it upwards, technically the inside of this zone could be used to place some sort of a botanical research facility or a garden, something that's hidden away underneath the surface. A lot of these ideas are highly improvisational. They come to me as I am working on the level layout and trying to come up with what is the player even supposed to be doing within this zone. I tried premeditatively come up with the purposes of these rooms and the contents within them, but it's honestly difficult. It's definitely difficult without a particular source of inspiration, which is actually the reason why I've recently been playing some of the older games that have a high level of interactability in the world, like Soma and Penumbra. Now, this garden, as mentioned before, is supposed to be effectively a slice of home for this civilization. It's the only remaining place where the original foliage, the original soil can be found, and this is where those who were born in the time of their home world still being intact come to reminisce on what they have lost and what it is that they're doing with their existence now. And a lot of this would be discovered through reading the various messages using the alien data tablets the player discovers throughout the ship. Also, because this is the first location the player discovers, I'm trying not to put in too many extremely alien forms in the architecture. The game has mentioned a particular human faction of extremely religious fanatics that have detached themselves from the main faction of the Imperium, and I want to lead the player onto a false direction, into making them think that this is basically one of their ships that has been lost in space, and avoid having too alien of architecture to try to not spoil the reveal. The Imperial soldier who is bringing you, the prisoner, back to undertake your sentencing will allude to the fact that this looks like the vessel of that quote-unquote religious fanatic faction, which has been a thorn in the Imperial operations for many, many decades. It may be successful, it may fail entirely. Some players may say, oh, this is clearly an alien ship right from the get-go, and you know what, that's fine. I'm going to try to not give away too much too early until that particular crucial point when the NPC and the player discovered the dead alien body for the very first time. Until then, I'm going to try to make the player believe that this is a human-made ship. Now, at this point, I have to start considering how the player is actually going to be traversing this environment, because technically, the player is not going to get the jetpack immediately from the start of the game. They have to do a little bit of exploration to earn that right, so to speak. Now, this means that from the beginning of the game, the player is going to have a fairly crippled range of movement. They have to rely on just their traversal and jumping to reach certain areas, which means it's actually going to be kind of tricky to get the player to reach this second and third level of this stargazing room. Now, canonically speaking, the aliens have been learning their meditative ways to the point where they have learned how to float. It's this particular stereotype of the Buddhist monks that they reach such level of enlightenment that they begin to float in midair. So I wanted to capitalize on that and say that yes, you can be so devoutly committed to the level of serenity and achieving your personal nirvana that you have learned the ability to defy the laws of physics and traverse space as if you're a fish in the water or bird in the air. The laws of physics are just another reality that you can accept or ignore. Now, this, of course, brings certain challenges to the level design, because this means that a lot of the buildings could quite literally have extended balconies onto which these aliens fly in and out of, almost like a landing pad for a helicopter, except, you know, they don't do the whole Mario spinaroo thing. Instead, there could very well be no stairs in any of the buildings. If we're talking about, let's say, elderly or the younglings who have either lost or never had the ability in the first place, or haven't reached to the point where they gain that ability, there would be a set of maybe gravity teleporters or hovering platforms. But of course, this early on, everything is dead. Everything is disabled. So no platforms means I have to give the player a different way of getting up there, which means we're probably going to have to involve some sort of a platforming segment. Now, how do we get those platforming segments into place? I could pre-place certain props like pillars and maybe some cabinets, some booths that maybe some plants used to grow in, and the player would have to jump from top to top to get to this other area. But I felt like pre-placing them might be a little bit too boring, so what I decided to do is to implement a physics-based crumbling pillar that would create the platforms that the player uses to jump up on top. And not only that, to make it interesting, I wanted the player to be the one that causes the pillar to crumble and create that passage. So maybe the player takes out a peg out of some sort of a flag holding pole, and that causes it to collapse onto an already cracked pillar, and that basically makes it topple over, creating a passage for you to climb up. Now, once again, I wanted to make a system that is quick to implement, so the general approach to it was to create a pillar in Blender, then use a shatter tool to crumble it into many, many different pieces. Then we use GD script in order to populate each and every chunk with a rigid body. Technically, the rigid body would have to be the parent, so we essentially just export the whole pillar as a GLTF file. We make sure that each and every pillar chunk has a dash call extension or suffix at the end of its name, which means that Godot, upon import, will generate all the necessary collisions for it. which means all we had left to do was to loop through the list of all the chunks, list of all the children, create a rigid body for each and every one of them, then take the chunk, put it into the rigid body, move the collision shape to be the child of the rigid body, and that's it. Just let the whole thing run and tumble. Now, I did come across a particular problem with that, and it's the fact that the player, with its infinite movement inertia, is capable of just moving these crumbling chunks with their body. So I could disable infinite inertia in the player, but then that presented some movement traversal issues, which I just didn't really want to be fixing, because it's one of those cases where it already worked and then my change made it worse. So maybe I can find a different way of solving the problem. So what I ended up doing is I ended up putting in a motion detection into the chunk code and making those chunks switch themselves from rigid to static when they have more or less settled enough, or when enough time has passed. Because you could end up with this one fidgety chunk that just won't settle, it just won't go to sleep, and we can't make it go become static because of that. So it was either the velocity would have to settle or the timer would have to run out. Either or, the chunks would become static. I really, really hoped that this would work. However, the biggest problem was the fact that it was just too unpredictable. The chunks would fall in a different manner each and every single time the game ran, which means that for some players, the chunks could fall in a way that creates a cohesive passage up. For other players, it could fall in such a way where there's just no way to reach a ledge. And that was not a good solution. Now, I haven't tried any other alternatives, but I kind of have an idea of how I can go about solving this issue. You see, what I could do is I could do the physics simulation of the chunks crumbling down in Blender, and then bake the individual chunk animations into bones, and then simply bake the animations of the bones, and then export the whole pillar as a rigged object. So that means that the crumbling effect is still simulated, so it still looks natural, but instead of being simulated live in the game, it's simply a replay of the simulation that has already happened in Blender. And I think that might actually work a lot better, and of course it would ensure that every player has a surefire way of getting up that little ledge. I'll be honest with you, I actually just came up with that idea, like literally right now as I'm recording this. That's what happens. You just have to leave a problem by itself for a little while, and your brain will just come up with a solution when it's ready. My father and I have a particular ritual where once every couple of days, I think we will watch some sort of a award-winning movie of the past to analyze how it was made from the perspective of storytelling, from the perspective of composition, from the perspective of pacing, and there would always be something to learn from in each and every movie. And this analysis is being used as a basis of our website, which is effectively a compilation of many different script writing tools. And considering that a lot of my games are story-based, narrative-based, that tool would be extraordinarily helpful for my projects. One of the things that we spot time and time again in well-made films, and the lack thereof in some pretty piss-poor productions, is that a lot of the events that take place in the story should take place because of certain characters and their behaviors. Things shouldn't just happen because they happen. Things should happen because a character made them happen, either because of their nature or because of their decisions, because of the utter inescapable hole they've dug themselves in, because that's something that makes a plot interesting to follow. When things happen just because they happen, that's not a compelling argument. I mean, that's not really interesting to look at. It is much more compelling to look at certain events unfolding in front of the hero when the hero is the reason for those events occurring. So it is for that reason that I think the pillar, which would be used to create a passage upwards, shouldn't crumble just by itself. It should crumble because the player did something in the world that caused something to topple over and then knock over this pillar. So this is where I was experimenting with that idea. There would be a flagpole or some sort of a prop that holds up some heavy object, and it would be a rigid body. The player walks up to it and performs an interaction with it and causes it to topple over, knock over a pillar, and then all the chunks would create the passage upwards. Another particular problem I came across is that there was a lot of the slope handling code missing from the player movement, and it was kind of difficult to traverse slopes upwards. Now, instead of diving into the rabbit hole of trying to fix this issue, which in retrospect technically wasn't all that difficult, I decided to try to establish some sort of a platforming section that would already be pre-placed in the level, which the player would use to get up to the second floor. Again, this is the stuff that has already been done, so any ideas I'm proposing now would probably be implemented in the next few sessions. We're starting to approach the up-to-date state of the game, so the stuff that I've been busy with for the past few sessions have been pretty much revolving all around the prop creation for the stargazing room. As we discussed, the stargazing room is supposed to be a garden, so there's going to be a lot of stone-based garden props. A lot of monuments for holding soil within which the plants would grow. A lot of the props that you would find in a park setting, like park benches, fountains. You would find a lot of tablets here to read and get some information on conversations and lore from. But in general, it's supposed to be a very garden-y sort of place. So here I was making a prop of a circular water fountain. It had a weird statue placed at the top of it, which I initially thought would be maybe repurposed as a healing station. You walk up to it and you get healed as long as you're within its proximity, which of course at some point the scout ship, which effectively contains medkit inside of it, would leave and you would no longer have access to that particular resource. And of course we cannot do that. We have to give the player multiple ways of healing themselves throughout the ship, so they don't have to now rely on their skill to make it to the end of the game without dying in the process. In a nutshell, however, eventually I thought that the prop at the top made it look too much like a penis, so I removed it. To be honest, this was kind of a lazily made statue anyways. It was basically just a wireframe modifier on the UV sphere in Blender. I tried to set up these props in an interesting layout to create a park-like theme, but I think I'm gonna have to get some references of existing parks to see what kind of shapes, passages, and roads, props are being used in these settings. I can definitely tell that at the moment I do not have enough props to pull off a some sort of a garden park type setting. In a nutshell, this space is supposed to be interesting to traverse, and it's supposed to very clearly communicate the purpose of the space. I'm gonna have to get a lot of dead trees, a lot of vines, a lot of dry leaves to litter the ground with. I expect to put in a lot of arches, a lot of pillars, a lot of pots for growing plants. In an attempt to get some sort of an idea of how to get the player up to the second floor, I had set up this set of placeholder meshes for the player to platform from and to. It's a really lazy solution, and it's too easy too. There's not a whole lot of gameplay involved in, well, doing this, just jumping from one platform to another. I mean, it's partially fun, but you can only get away with so much platforming. So it was more of a means to have something in place so that I felt like at least something was moving forward. And then now that I'm making this video, I'm getting all these ideas of how to resolve this problem with pre-animated pillar collapse and getting the platforming action to get us to a different area that will allow us to trigger the collapse. I've also taken a moment to establish some placeholder soundtracks for the stargazing area, for the botanical garden that's suspended in the ceiling, although we have no way of actually reaching that at the moment. Placeholder soundtrack for the lower level of the stargazing area, which is the soundtrack that's played when you first step out of the ship and are greeted with this strange new place, as well as when you actually enter the second level. That's when you physically enter the botanical garden environment. So the soundtrack there would be a little bit different. Again, these soundtracks may not be what I'm going to be using in the end. Maybe they are, maybe they'll grow on me, but they definitely help me to immerse myself in the environment, to create new ideas that are relevant to the atmosphere I'm trying to establish. Music really makes it a lot easier to submerge into the world you're making, so that's why I try to create some placeholder ambiances and listen to those as I'm creating new ideas. We got to make some sort of a longer detour to make this platforming part, well, take a little bit longer. So I'd say things are going fairly well on this front. So next I decided to work a little bit on revamping some of the level geometry, mainly by adding additional ledges so that the player can't just jump over the top due to the high slope climbing ability. And then I decided to work on some props based on the concept art that was recently submitted by our concept artist. This was a compilation of a few silhouettes for pillars and arches, and these had a very interesting blocky look to them, which, to be honest, made the pillars look a lot more interesting to look at. I can imagine that between the arches and the pillars, there could be some sort of a grid-like mesh that could be used to establish the walls that separate multiple segments between the rooms of the stargazing zone. Something that I thought was never going to be a problem was coming up with the idea of what is the player supposed to be even doing in this game. I mean, yes, there is a huge story for the player to discover, but that's not the only selling point of a game. There's got to be something for the player to do. And so far we do have technically a list of base mechanics, like we can use the drone, we can scan the environment, but that's more narrative based if anything. We can use platforming, we have the jetpack, but I mean, besides that, what else is there to do? So while I'm trying to ponder on this problem, I decided to do some binge 3D model creation. Basically just focusing on creating all the props for the stargazing area. In this particular case, it's an elongated plant pot, so to speak. There's a segment at the top and a segment all around for growing your plants. And I decided to go for 2 small bush-like trees at the top segment, and the surrounding segments technically would also be filled with some sort of dried out dead greenery, but I haven't gotten to the point of creating those props yet. Now, one particular aspect of these props is that I wanted to make sure that it doesn't appear like it's the same exact prop repeated over and over and over again. So what I ended up doing is generating a number of these trees, exporting them out as individual tree objects, and simply programming Godot to randomly choose and randomly rotate 2 of those trees per each plant. This is done in the ready function. It just instances a mesh instance and then populates it with a randomly chosen preloaded mesh. So this actually gave these plant pots a more organic look. It didn't look like it was the same asset repeated over and over and over again. I think this is an approach I'm going to take to a lot of the other assets in the game as well. At this point, my computer actually started crashing quite often due to a system disk hard drive slowly dying on me. So I had recently replaced it with a solid state, brand new hard drive. So so far no crashes, but we'll see how that goes. And of course, the project is all backed up and it's stored on a separate drive. And I have a NAS sitting at home that's keeping constant backups of my project hard drive. Like hell am I losing any of this progress? Hell nah. So this next prop was effectively a plant pillar. It's supposed to be a very large, thick pillar that is surrounded by growing plants. And once I had actually placed the plants inside and then placed the props into the game, I realized that there's an interesting potential for some peculiar platforming opportunities that could be based around this pillar. As a matter of fact, now that I think about it, a lot of the destinations could be made reachable by a multitude of passages. There could be some cracks along the walls that the player could maybe traverse through. The player could maybe also jump from pillar to pillar, from plant pot to plant pot, reaching higher and higher heights and reaching the destination that way. It might actually make for quite an interesting approach to the level, where there's more than one way to reach your destination. Now, this particular plant pillar was actually made out of a set of meshes, one for the pillar itself, one for the plant pot, and one for the vines that were generated by the Ivy plugin in Blender. Now, I had to generate collisions for this whole prop, and the problem there is that if I use tri-mesh collisions, which is perfectly quick, it would actually create a horrendously over-complicated collision simply because of all the vines in this prop. So what I had to do to fix this issue, to resolve it, is I had to make sure that I export the plant pots, the pillar, and the vines as 3 separate meshes. And what that allowed me to do is to generate a tri-mesh collision shape for the pillar, then generate a simplified convex collision shape for the pots, because they have a lot of carving detail in them that don't necessarily need to be traversed into collision data. So a simplified collision shape would work a heck of a lot better. And of course, the plants themselves, the vines, the ivy, had no collisions whatsoever, because it doesn't need to have any collisions. It would be too precise. It would cost too many resources to calculate collisions for them, and it is simply unnecessary. I mean, it's like generating a collision shape for each and every grass blade in an FPS game. It's unnecessary. There's no reason for it. It would just be a waste of resources. So by simply separating the objects, the 3 components of this pillar, I was able to generate a relatively efficient collision shape. final bit of progress I have pulled off for the Angular project was the creation of another piece of the stargazing room, which is a circular plant plot which the player can actually walk into. I thought it made for a kind of a cozy space. You're surrounded by greenery, or technically dead greenery, but you know, who's counting? But you're technically able to discover some tablet inside. Maybe it's hidden in one of the compartments. It's just generally an interesting looking shape to just be inside of, be surrounded by these slots. It's all about just creating an interesting to be in space. So I'm trying to create props that reinforce the idea of a garden, and these are props that are hopefully interesting to look at and interesting to traverse. So this is all the progress we have made for the Angular project for the past technically 2 months, I would say, because it has been quite a while since our last report. So hopefully I can switch to a nice monthly report instead of doing the weekly one, because I'm sure that's just annoying to look at. Not everybody has this much time to spend on watching a dev progress report on a weekly basis. And of course, it's not going to be one that's going to be, well, months apart, because people just kind of forget that this even exists, lose interest, and that's not really a good way to go about it. So why don't we move on to the next project that I have been busy working on. This is a really weird position that I'm in right now. I've started the Atomicon project as, well, one of my side prototypes. And while I was working on it, I decided to run a game jam. And during the game jam, I proposed an idea for making a little mini game. And that mini game is called Angler, the game that you have heard me talk about for the past hour. So clearly that mini game stopped being a mini game and turned into a full-size project, which means Atomicon just kind of took a back seat because, well, I have so many balls in the air I can't even count them. But considering that Angler is a really interesting project for me to work on, and so is Atomicon, I am trying to do something that would keep the project going without me committing, let's say, many hours into it, like I would with a mainline project. So what I figured I was gonna do is maybe dedicate about an hour of every development day, something in the morning, to modeling something out of this game, some sort of a prop or some sort of a model. It could be any piece of city infrastructure. It could be a vehicle, could be some sort of a robot or a trash can or a bus stop. A little bit of progress is better than no progress. And if you do little things for a very long time, they tend to accumulate. So even if I'm only working on props and models, A, I still get to practice modeling, and B, I actually get some assets for the Atomicon project once that becomes the mainline project again. So what you see me working on are a couple of different models for just basic routine objects you would find in the world. They include the telephone booth, the product shelf for a mall, a light post, a street lamp basically, a beverage dispensary, and a robot that refills the beverage dispensary. The prop in front of you is a telephone booth, and this telephone booth isn't going to be just a static object. What I want to do with it is implement it into some sort of a hacking game mechanic where you can transfer information by connecting your portable terminal to one of these telephones and try to hack into nearby devices or nearby infrastructure. Like, for example, if there is a public bus stop with a locked door, if you plug in a battery into that bus stop and locate some sort of a public telephone booth that is located within reasonable distance, then you would be able to try to hack into that door using that telephone booth and your portable terminal. And of course, if you were to think about, say, character stats or character skills, you could have a particular skill that allows you to extend the range of your hacking ability. It means that the telephone booth could be located further away from a targeted object, and you would still be able to hack into it. These terminals can also be used to store little data dumps, allowing you to get some clues about the environment, the world, and maybe even get solutions to possible problems, like how to get into certain zones. Maybe there's a message that was in transit and was saved in the buffer of the telephone because it sits on the same network as, let's say, other computer terminals. So it would store a message saying that there's a loose air vent that the player can climb into to get into a particular locked area. I gotta say, some of my most favorite videos are people going into the woods and digging up really old vehicles, like old Studebakers and trucks and whatnot, and just digging them up, giving them a bit of oil, a little bit of cleanup, and getting them to run again. It's that moment when old technology comes back to life. I love watching these videos. And I want to recreate that sort of a feeling in this game, which is why I want to try to make a good amount of technology in this game be reusable for your strategic needs. So if there's a car, you can fix it up, not ride it, but you could turn on the engine, turn the lights on if that's needed. And of course, that means that in the land, there could be some mutated creatures that are light sensitive, so this would be your way of surviving in the night. Or alternatively, you could use these vehicles to recharge your batteries for your equipment. But I believe we have already discussed the subject. Nevertheless, for now, what I'm doing is just making the prop models so that we have some content to work with once I get back to the project. On the side note, here's some incentive for you. If you want to see me work on this project more, help me finish one of my existing projects. I need to give the folks that are helping me work on this project a financial incentive to put in more time to get the project done faster, especially the concept artists and the 3D modelers. Remember, this is a freelance project. It has no budget. So except for me, everyone else who is helping me out with the Angler project is putting in only the time that they can afford to put in, and we all share either the collective revenue or the collective loss on the project doing financially well or poorly. With that said, I have a pretty decent job that keeps me going, so I don't really need Patreon, which is why I haven't really been pushing it in any of my videos. But it doesn't mean that it's a completely useless resource. It could still help me help the folks that are helping me with these projects. This is simply one of those indisputable truths I have discovered with my own personal experience. If a project pays immediately, people are more motivated to work on it. And I think from these videos, I would say that everyone's been doing a pretty gosh darn good job. So hey, keep it in the back of your mind, consider it. Maybe if you're gonna see more of these consistent update videos, then perhaps we'll have a more solid argument for you to support us. Because I'm sure nobody wants to sink money into a developer that does an update once every 3 months and then disappears into thin air. I'm gonna try to see if I can do these as monthly updates, and we'll see how it goes. This next prop is a sugary drink dispenser. Now, I haven't come up with any particular brand names. Obviously, we're thinking something along the lines of some sort of a cola or other carbonated beverage. We are gonna have to do a lot of world building on this one. We gotta come up with all sorts of brand names, and of course, we don't want them to be super empty. We gotta give them an appropriate background story, because the only way these fictional brands in franchises like Fallout really have any weight to their name is because their stories have actually been developed quite thoroughly. There are key characters that have connections to large corporate names in the Fallout universe, so if we want to hold a candle to such a huge franchise, I will have to be doing a lot of writing. Well, good thing I enjoy it, because I wouldn't be as peppy if I knew how much work I'd have to sink into it. Now, in this world, I wanted to lean in heavily into the story of the capitalist world that is United States. And I wanted to push certain concepts a lot further, maybe take the alternate timeline idea, except push it in a more ideological way, where it's perhaps it's a comparison of what happens when two humongous ideologies come down clashing together. Say, for example, if the Soviet Union did not break apart and it continued growing. And the whole appeal of Marxism was that it was an alternative to capitalism, and it was allegedly supposed to resolve a lot of the issues that capitalism came with. Of course, we all know how that ended, and neither is the story taking place in Europe. So since we're on the American soil here, we're going to be exploring at what happens when, let's say, United States keeps going the direction that it is going right now, losing many of its industry and the knowledge that comes with it because they've been outsourcing most of their production overseas, and generally capitalism being ingrained into the everyday life of every small business owner, every citizen, the whole nation, really. And in one way this would be projected is the fact that with a lot of the vending machines in this game, where you would have to pay for access to the resources, even in a post-apocalyptic landscape. And this would be a bit different from the way Fallout handled it, where any vending machine is basically just another container. It kind of sounds dumb when you put it this way, because you already have to pay the vending machines to get their contents, but this would be a post-apocalyptic environment, and even as you're trying to survive, you still have to give up something to gain access to these resources. This particular prop is a gas station unit, which the player would be able to use to get gas, obviously. Of course, you cannot drive vehicles in a post-apocalyptic environment because vehicles just made you skip a lot of interesting locations that you would otherwise discover on foot. When you're in the vehicle, it's difficult to create random encounters when characters approach you because, well, you're in a different class of an environment when you're in the vehicle. You are not perceived as a vulnerable survivor. You're basically in a tank at that point. But the player would be able to get gas in order to fill up the half-destroyed vehicles that are scattered, that haven't been looted of their parts by then. And the player would be able to use that gas to give the vehicle a little bit of juice and make use of its onboard facilities, like the lights, the generator that would be charging the player's batteries. Perhaps the onboard radio could be used in order to tap into the nearby broadcasts. Maybe there's going to be number stations that would be clashing with local frequencies, so when you turn on a radio on the car and then swipe through the frequencies, you might stumble upon some sort of a beacon. And if we're thinking about survival, something that hasn't been introduced in the Fallout survival mode is the concept of you getting cold at night. So you could use the vehicle's radiators in order to keep yourself from freezing to death at night. I really want to bring a survival component to this game because we already have a post-apocalyptic shooter that is pretty much a, Boomy McShooty type of game. The things that I want to bring forward are more focused on the components of the game that I personally enjoy, which is survival in a harsh environment that exceeds your personal abilities, and surviving it in more than just, oh, you're hungry, oh, you're thirsty, oh, you haven't slept in a while, oh no, you stepped into the lake, now you have worms. All of those things are nice, but I think that the concept of survival could be more than just those particular basic components. And of course, another aspect is that I wanted to make the world be more interactive. Like, Fallout has these amazing looking props that are just set pieces. They don't really serve much of a purpose. And it works absolutely fine in the case of Fallout, but I wanted to explore a different direction, the one that Fallout would probably never explore because it would be outside of the scope of an already established genre and franchise. This next prop is a robot that is supposed to be randomly appearing in the wasteland and refilling or servicing the pop stations that you saw me develop earlier. And a particular funny interaction that could be had with these robots is that if you try to attack them, they will attack back, but they don't have any weapons on them. Instead, they just fling bottles of soda in your face. It's basically the rocket launcher from Fallout 3. You just use whatever junk in the inventory you have as projectiles. In this case, it might also be kind of fun if you could hack into it, perhaps while it is tethered to a soda machine. So if there's a nearby computer terminal or a public telephone, you could use that to tap into this robot while it is connected to the vending machine and maybe disable it. Maybe you can then approach it and inspect its inventory, or grab whatever useful components you might need for crafting. Now, I gotta say, I wasn't really too happy with the design. I think it came out a little bit too bulky. I wanted to have something that's around the size of maybe a Mr. Handy, like maybe two Mr. Handys. I don't want it to be too ginormous, because then it looks like a giant flying refrigerator. I definitely don't want these things to be larger than the vending machine that they're servicing. All in all, it would be a randomly encountered NPC, so to speak. It just flies around from vending machine to vending machine, servicing them, keeping them running, keeping them stocked up and operating. And that would actually explain why the vending machines in the post-apocalyptic environment are always stocked up. It's because this autonomous system somehow managed to survive a nuclear end of the world and has been running without human interference for many years since. I definitely think I'm going to be remaking this model, though. I think that it was good experience in trying to figure out how I would go about rigging this, because there are technically two movable components and they move together but in an individual fashion. So I will simply take the knowledge I've gotten by experimenting with this rig and just moving that over to the next rendition of this robot. The next couple of props were ones that I had painted concept art for. So maybe the robot didn't really turn out that well because I tried to improvise on it instead of drawing it out first. But then again, the soda vending machine and the telephone booth actually came out quite well, in my opinion, being improvised. And I have been attempting to create concept art for the telephone booth, and I don't think I was getting very good ideas. So it's a really weird thing. In some cases, you could improvise the whole prop right from the get-go. In other cases, you need to put something on paper and see if you can experiment with some ideas there. This particular prop was a secondary newspaper stand, because we are technically in a world that has competing businesses. So we already have one newspaper stand. This would be one belonging to a different company. And I think that both newspaper stands that I've made before and this one that we're making here simply give a lot of aesthetical value to the game. Sure, they both technically serve the same purpose, but the value here is not in its function, but more in its aesthetic appeal. One thing I am wondering is whether or not to make the top and the bottom containers as two separate containers, or if I should handle them as one single container instead. Technically, if I look towards the prototypes, the Fallout 3 has a cluster of lockers, and when you interact with it, you're technically just interacting with the whole aggregate rather than an individual locker. But then contrast that to Fallout 4, there are individual locker meshes available, so it's kind of a weird dichotomy. So I guess I can just choose whatever I want. The benefit of it is that there's more containers to loot, so the player has more to do. Doesn't really take a lot of work to program in. It's basically just using the same container code we have already used before. I believe I've already mentioned in one of the last videos that the container code is actually fairly modular. It's not tied to any particular container, could really be tied to anything, like could be tied to a corpse technically. You could just treat it as a container of stuff. So yeah, just about anything in this world could be a container. It really doesn't take a lot of work to turn anything into one. Nevertheless, for the time being, I'm just handling modeling. I am not really focusing on any texturing, just because I wanted to have some meshes to play around with, and texturing really isn't going to be necessarily bringing a heck of a lot of benefit to something that's basically a prototype at the moment. As a matter of fact, I think music and sound would be a lot more likely to be implemented even in some sort of a placeholder state than textures. But then again, you never know. I could just get bored of modeling and want to do some texturing just to keep the wheels rolling. Another prop we have here is a display cabinet for some gift items that you would find in the Mega Mall, within which technically this game is supposed to take place. As I've covered before, this isn't me trying to make an entire open world survival game. This is more me trying to make just a teeny little segment that the player would discover, visit, explore, and then go through the story that is tied to the owner of that Mega Mart. I just want to focus on that one particular experience, and if it goes well, then it could be expanded into a full game. I mean, most of the props would still be there, you just have to add to the additional roster. Most of the mechanics will already be programmed. The inventory system, the quest system, dialogue system, all of that would already be in there, and my approach to these systems is such that expanding them with additional content and additional quests is pretty effortless. I tend to go for modular systems even if it isn't a huge game, just because I'm basically riding off of the experience of making these systems over and over and over and over again for many of my prototypes. So I could remake it from scratch probably faster than if I were to design a new system that was using smaller and more lightweight concepts than what I'm using right now. The next prop would be a piece of city infrastructure, a light post or street lamp that illuminates the roads that you end up traversing. Now, the design of this lamp, I gotta admit, is really exaggerated. It looks like something straight from the Jetsons. I wouldn't really consider that to be a regular piece of city infrastructure, even for a game that's in a post-apocalyptic, retrofuturistic world. But nevertheless, this could be the sort of street lamp that would be commissioned for an extravagant looking super mega mart who's been coerced into spending exorbitant amount of his fortune on frivolous things that wouldn't really improve his business by a con man, which is of course totally not the setting of the main quest that the player would be experiencing here. In any case, this light post would have a side panel that the player can access in order to insert a couple of batteries, insert some fuses, and basically turn the light on when they have to take some shelter from some sort of, again, mutants that are light sensitive. I am a huge fan of horror and science fiction and mystery, especially when those concepts come together. So you can expect that there's going to be some horror in this game. Anyways, this is all the progress that we've done on the Atomicon project. Again, it's kind of been sidestepped by the Angular project. It's a minigame that blew out of proportion. You know, it's a tale that's as old as time, but, you know, I wanted to put in some work into it so that it doesn't look like it's just sitting on the sidelines. In any case, why don't we move on to the next project and see what other progress we've made there. Last place I've left off with the RTAG Rise project was trying to figure out how to communicate to the player that they are capable of interacting with a particular component in the level. In the old version of the project made in GameMaker Studio, I was using little pop-ups, and these pop-ups depicted the key that you'd have to press in order to interact with the object. So if you held, let's say, a PlayStation 3 controller and you used some sort of a plugin to play with it, then any interactable components like switches and generators would depict a little circle with a rect square in it, indicating what you have to press to interact with it. But this time around, I figured, well, isn't the player going to be taught that they have to press the interact button to interact with something? Isn't there going to be a tutorial that will tell them this is the button you press to interact with something? So I figured in that case, maybe we could make our labels a little bit more useful. We could make them say what it is that you can do with this prop. So if you're standing next to the valve would say spin. If you're standing next to the generator would say turn on or enable or spin up, if this is one of those props that has to be interacted with multiple times to spin them up to speed to be enabled. Now, of course, since this game might potentially have a lot of interactable objects, I wanted to make sure that I don't have to create a new label for each and every single one of them. So once again, the modular approach it is. So what I've done is I've created a single object, a single scene that contains the label. It has the code that makes it appear and the code that makes it disappear, and it has a place to store the word or sentence that should appear when this label shows up. So this means that I can place this label into just about any interactable object I want and simply tell that interactable object in the ready function to address its label and tell it to say this or that. And that would be perfectly customized to every object there is. Now, I am still on the cusp of it because technically, if you're looking at a valve, you can already tell what you can do with the valve. It would say spin, and you would know that if you see a valve and interact with it, you would spin it. So is there really any need to say it, right? It's one of those show, don't tell type of scenarios. So I'm still on the cusp of it. Maybe I'll go back to icons, or who knows? Maybe if I like both systems, then I'll just implement both systems. It's not like with a modular approach, you have to do a lot of work anyways. So we'll see how it goes. In the realm of progress, we are still going down the script, the written story, and we're looking at what is supposed to happen next in the script and just implementing that, just going step by step. I gotta say, I'm spending a massive amount of time on this one particular level because this one particular level actually happens to be using a lot of mechanics that would be found throughout the entire game. So what I'm projecting is gonna happen is that as soon as I'm done with this level, the progress on other levels might actually be a lot faster because I have developed just about every system in this one level that would be met in other scenes. The dialogue system, the conversations, the sound triggering, sound effects, explosions, interacting with objects, picking objects up and then moving them around, having labels show up, having connections and triggerable objects, having dialogues trigger chains of events, all of which are, of course, built in such a way that I can reuse them in any level, anytime. I'm sure that only time will tell just how fast it will go, but I am pretty happy with how much progress I've been doing in the past few months of working on this. Nevertheless, I still can't wait to move on to more of the level execution because the dialogue we've been recording sounds real exciting to try to execute as a game developer. So in any case, going down the script, the next thing that the players are supposed to be able to do is to deposit an X amount of orbs into the little receptacle. These orbs are currently just being spawned in random locations throughout the level, but ultimately there's going to be a prop that looks like maybe a break in the line, and the orbs just kind of fall out of it. Now, a lot of these challenges are meant to be done in co-op, so it does bring up a question I'm gonna have to ponder upon of what I'm gonna do when there's only a single player playing it. Is that single player gonna be doing tasks for both players, or is the task that you're supposed to do will be dependent on which character you choose to play? So does the other character's task just get written off right away? Do I program an AI to complete those tasks? It is gonna be a weird question to answer. So this particular orb receptacle is supposed to effectively be a crucial component that has to be completed to launch the teleporter, which the players are going to be using to get out of this burning hellfire. Now, the prop works in a way where the player has to bring the orbs that appear on the screen of this prop. So we have to have some sort of a monitor that displays the information about what orb it is currently expecting, how much time is left before it times out and tells you to bring a different orb, as well as how many orbs you have already brought. So again, in the light of placeholder assets, I had set up a quick monitor that displays that information. The next part of the script requires the players to keep the generators that just spent several minutes booting up from exploding. So the general concept is that the room is filled with fire, it is hot, everything is overheating, you have to keep everything cool. One of those things is, of course, the briefcase of medicine that the players are tasked to deliver back to their camp in this particular side quest, and of course everything else in this room is also overheating, including the generators. So the idea is that the generators only start getting overheated after a certain amount of tasks has been finished, so they don't all just pile on all these tasks all in one go, and the players have to run around between the 3 generators, turning on the valves that would enable the sprinklers above them, cooling them down in the process. It was also important to very clearly communicate that the generators are in danger. So I've gone ahead and added an Omnilight to the top of the generators and made it pulsate using a sine wave. Now, I have tried making the pulses be different among the 3 generators to offset them in time and a little bit in rate, but to be honest, that had created way too much chaos, and the eye was just darting between everywhere. It's just way too distracting. The generators being in danger and have that red glow pulsate in them is only supposed to be serving as a warning, but not as a distraction. So even though it would technically make sense for the generators to not flash the red light at the same time, but I decided to keep them synchronized so that it was more of an informational warning rather than a distraction. Of course, to deal with the overheating generators, the players would have to run between the 3 valves, enabling them one by one, which would turn on the sprinklers above each generator and keep the generator from exploding. Of course, as soon as the heat level of the generator reaches maximum, that is an instant game over, but there should be plenty of warning before that happens. And of course, to make things challenging, the players can't just turn on all 3 valves and be done with it. So what I've done is program the valves to become ineffective if all 3 of them are turned on. So the players have to do some timekeeping and keep running between the 3 valves, disabling one that has already reduced the heat of one generator so that we can turn another one on and actually make it do something. Now, the sprinkler's ability to stifle fire is set via an export variable, which means I don't really have to dive into the code to fine-tune that timing, and would be able to balance out the experience with relatively challenging time sets. Now, of course, these valves are going to be hidden behind panels, so they are not going to become visible until they are absolutely needed. If we have the player entering a level and seeing a bajillion interactable components, that's just going to overwhelm them senselessly, and that's just not a fun experience. In this particular case, we're just going to be gradually revealing each and every mechanic as they become needed. And for the most part, we're simply going to hide these interactable components behind background panels, wall panels, and just make the panel pop off as if from an explosion on cue whenever that mechanic needs to be dealt with. Also, here's that dynamic label I mentioned earlier. As you can see here, I'm testing the appearance of the valves. I turn all the generators on, which makes the progress bar fill in the middle of the level, and shortly after, the panels fly off and revealing the valves behind them. And of course, the valves only become interactable when they get revealed, so that spin label doesn't appear until the valves are actually fully revealed. Of course, the next largest component that I absolutely have to implement is the dialogue system. Now, in this particular case, the dialogue system has a particular quirk that hasn't been present in any of the other projects I'm working on, and that is the fact that characters have to be able to execute a dialogue between them without actually having the player walk up to anybody and press any buttons. Certain dialogues are scripted events. They have to take place when the players reach a certain location, perform a certain task, or maybe they're just walking by a particular area and they cross a trigger zone. A dialogue has to take place, and it should not be blocking the player's ability to move around or control the character. Now, I have technically already created this system. The only problem is that that system was created long before I had standardized my dialogue building procedure with the Dialogi tool. So I felt that I could technically stick to that system, but then I would practically be remaking the same system twice. Once for those dialogues that take place without the players interacting with anybody, and the other dialogue would be for those NPCs that you do walk up to, press a button, and it locks your input and allows you to proceed with conversation with that character. So I would have ended up with two dialogue systems. I decided that it's probably going to be, well, first good practice, but also make any future dialogue revisions a lot simpler if I remake the system from scratch. Now, my goal was to do as little programming as possible when I'm remaking the system. So I ended up actually reusing the NPC dialogue, the one you would engage with by walking up to an NPC and talking to them, except the way I achieved it is by making an invisible NPC object that uses a kinematic body, runs the NPC script, but is missing any other of the optional nodes, and it's simply sitting as a singleton outside of the camera view. And technically, even if it was in the camera view, it has no visible nodes in it, so it wouldn't really matter anyways. And it just sits there and it waits to be triggered by the area node trigger zones. So this kind of reminds me of the mind-boggling revelation when I watched a YouTuber play Fallout New Vegas, where the cutscenes that the player witnesses in the beginning and in the end of the game, outlining the summary of their adventures and what happens to various camps and factions they engaged with, the voiceover is actually executed quite literally by some weird-looking NPC standing behind the slide screen projection, behind the mesh of the screen. They quite literally made a separate NPC that used their already existing dialogue system, just placed it behind out of the view, out of sight, and made them go through the dialogues, and that's basically it. So you know what? If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. So I ended up going through the dialogue and then kind of copying it over to Dialogi, establishing the dialogue, and I actually ended up having to create a new type of message in the Dialogi tool specifically for automated self-advancing messages for the conversations between NPCs that take place without the player's involvement or interaction. Usually, when you are engaged in conversation with NPC, the kind that blocks your movement, you have control over the progression of the dialogue. You have to press a button to get the dialogue to move forward. Now, in this particular case, we can't really expect the dialogue to wait for the player's input while the player is in the middle of already running around the level and trying to survive and trying to make it past all the hazards. So that dialogue had to be automated, which means all I had to really do is add an additional message type, which would be an auto message. It's just a message that proceeds to the next dialogue message when it's finished running its current one. And the criteria for moving forward was simply to wait, I think it's like an extra quarter second or extra half second after the audio file for that particular dialogue was finished. And this right here is what the dialogue system sounds like with all the dialogues in place.
There it is! I told you we'd find the phase gate here. Okay, great. How are we gonna operate it, genius? It's fine, we'll just improvise. I saw Adam trick one of these things into gating us outside the facility. We'll be fine.
Are you completely insane? You're gonna get us killed!
You got any better ideas? Because I don't think this briefcase is meant to withstand this heat. It'll ruin the cure.
If we teleport in the middle of a wall, the cure will be destroyed anyway. Let me try to hack into it and dial the address manually.
We don't have time. All we need is to jumpstart the generators, pick out a few plasma cylinders, and we can force this thing to get us out of here. Come on!
Don't do anything stupid.
Oh,
We'll
God.
boot this thing up and dial the address by hand. But whatever happens, don't let the briefcase overheat.
I won't.
Oh. I don't see the briefcase heat meter. Oh, because it wasn't showing. It wasn't hot enough. Oh no. The next step I wanted to take was to recreate the effect that was basically the staple of the RTAG Rise project, even when it was a Game Maker Studio game. The notorious screen bend effect that I got, well, a lot of comments on when I was showcasing the project. It was one of the things that made the project stand out, and I definitely wanted to implement the same effect in the Godot Engine version of the game. It's just, at this point, it has basically become a part of the game's identity. And the funny thing is that this effect was actually just accidentally discovered when I was goofing around with the Five Nights at Freddy's shader tutorial that I made many years ago. I thought, what would it look like if I had applied this effect to a 2D game? Just out of curiosity, just for shits and giggles. And it actually came out quite amazing looking. It made the game stand out from all the other 2D platformers out there. It's a fairly innocuous effect, but it could be used to enhance certain events like death screens or explosions. Now, I have technically already made this effect once, but the only problem is that I had achieved it by creating a separate viewport and then nesting within that viewport the level that we were playing. That came with a particular set of baggage, which essentially meant that my level loading and unloading would have to be custom written. The entire game would have to load in the next level, then unload the previous level, and then reveal one on top of the other, which is technically how Godot Engine used to recommend you change levels. But to be honest, for me, change scene to function that basically just loads in the next level and just immediately displays it was the most optimal and the easiest way to transfer to the next level, and a lot of the systems were already coded around it. So I decided to implement or remake the screen bend effect using the recent discovery that visual shaders can actually simply take the content of the screen and well, apply that screen to, say, a sprite or some sort of a texture, and apply all your shader needs to that. So I used to do this to the viewport, but now I can simply take the contents of the game that have already been rendered, display it again on top of the game, and apply the appropriate distortions in it. The end result is the same, except now there's less hassle with that parent viewport and parent container and level swapping. And I swear, I think the second attempt of making this effect actually produced a much better result. I have no way of knowing because I think I deleted the old version, but it works, so I'm happy. My next task was to fix up the horrendous arrangement of lights in this level. There were too many lights that all looked kind of the same, and it was just creating a completely piss poor composition. I needed to have something more uniform, less is better in this particular case, so I opted in for a one big light that effectively acted almost like a vignette, and it made the whole environment visible, but visibly darker. And this allowed me to also reduce the amount of lights that are in the level, so when the power comes on, there's only like maybe 3 lights that get enabled, which looks a lot more effective than a whole bunch of lights coming online. Since I was on the subject of lights, I ended up making an animation of the lights kind of glitching online and then triggering those animations at a particular time offset between one another, so the lights in this level gradually come online one after another in this slow, methodical, glitchy fashion, instead of all turning on immediately right from the get-go. Now, sure, I didn't have to handle this. I didn't have to make this effect this early on. We're still technically on the early stages of development, but hey, you know what? I've programmed it, it's already there, and it's modular. I can just reuse it on other lights. Now, this kind of opened up a can of worms or a can of whoop-ass, I don't know which one, but I ended up focusing on trying to establish a proper atmosphere of urgency in this level, and the entire level right now had like this argument between the two characters, but at the same time, the whole level didn't really enforce an idea of urgency. So what I ended up doing is creating a single explosion scene, which I would then instance anytime the timer ran out and the explosion had to take place. So again, it's do it once, reuse it as many times as you want sort of approach. The particles were achieved using some sort of a dirt texture I had created months ago, and a particle system, exploding particles in all directions, changed their color from orange to red to a smoky color, and then I've established a number of node to D nodes scattered all over this level, and a piece of code that would randomly choose one of those node to D nodes and simply instance a new explosion and position it there. Along with the explosion, I had also programmed a screen shake that would, of course, trigger anytime an explosion is instanced. These two effects together really made it feel like there's an actual catastrophe happening in the level rather than the characters just kind of arguing and saying that it is. Again, show don't tell is a concept that really goes a long way here, and I honestly tend to forget just how effective it is.
There it is. I told you we'd find the phase gate here. Okay, great. How are we gonna operate it, genius? It's fine, we'll just improvise. I saw Adam trick one of these things into gating us outside the facility. We'll be fine.
Are you completely insane? You're gonna get us killed!
You got any better ideas? Because I don't think this briefcase is meant to withstand this heat. It'll ruin the cure.
If we teleport in the middle of a wall, the cure will be destroyed anyway. Let me try to hack into it and dial the address manually.
We don't have time. All we need is to jumpstart the generator, take out a few plasma cylinders, and we can force this thing to get us out of here. Come on!
Don't do anything stupid. We'll boot this thing up and dial the address by hand. And whatever happens, don't let the briefcase overheat.
I won't.
I also ended up replacing the soundtrack to something that I've written many years ago for this game, and I was surprised at how well this was working, but I cannot use it here. This is a soundtrack that is reserved for one of the boss battles, and there's going to be plenty of opportunities to write even better music. Anyways, moving on. Continuing to go down the script, the next task the players will be faced with is to reconnect a number of pipes that would fall out of the wall to the appropriate colored receptacle. Now, this makes this level pretty jam-packed with various tasks, but thankfully these tasks would be repeated later down the line, and it has to be done in the service of establishing a particularly intense situation, and this is one of the quirks you can use when you're doing storytelling, is you could put the viewer, or in this case the player, through some sort of an intense situation where they have to really focus on completing the task, surviving, getting something done, going through some adrenaline driven action, and then when you wind it down directly after, you can actually present any sort of exposition, any information dump, any sort of lore that you want to teach the player is actually perfect within these little pockets of relaxation that the players go through when they exit some sort of a tense situation, because they're all relaxed, their nervous system is just overdriven, they're finally taking a break from this intense action, and that's exactly when they lose their guard. Their cognitive abilities are taking a break from what just happened, and any information, any sort of lore you'd like to feed them just sinks right like a sponge. And since this is technically the very first level the players would witness when they play the demo, I need to make sure that it's this like high octane, high action type of level, so that by the end of it, I can finally introduce the proper exposition and proper info dump about what kind of quest this is, which technically is the place where the story would be told. So what I've been doing here is developing a system that allows me to create a pipe, and this pipe could be picked up by its end and delivered to a particular receptacle where it can be connected. This is basically your standard rigid vines or cables mechanic. All you have to really do is get a bunch of rigid bodies chained together with pin joints and make them ignore each other using for loops, and then simply get the player to attach and grab the very end of it and drag it around. The receptacles that these pipes get connected to are all working together. They're sending their signals that something has entered them, or the correct pipe has entered them, into this modular node that is counting how many times that signal has been received. And if it counts the necessary amount of connections, then it progresses the dialogue system to move forward to the next message. And a lot of things here are done in that fashion. A lot of the scripted event dialogue system is basically a whole bunch of invisible nodes in the background that are all counting how many activities you have finished, or how many times you've completed this particular activity before triggering the next part of the dialogue. And again, the reason why it's made using these invisible nodes instead of being hard-coded into the script is so that it is modular, so that I can recreate this same sort of system in any other node, in any other place, and have the player complete a certain X amount of objectives before the next part of the dialogue kicks in. Now, of course, these pipes are not supposed to be in the level from the get-go. They are supposed to be triggered by a particular event. The players have to keep the briefcase cool for long enough. They have to bring in an X amount of orbs into the receptacle. They have to enable all the generators so the power comes on. So all of these things have to be executed long before the pipes themselves drop. There's a certain sense of pacing that has to be performed here. After the player finishes one task, you got to give them a few seconds to, ravel in their achievement, and only then introduce an additional challenge. So the code that actually spawns the chain of the pipe ended up being offset from the ready function into a custom function. And again, the modular dialogue handling node that counts how many achievements you have just performed or how many tasks you've just completed will eventually force the pipe objects to trigger their function that generates the pipes, and it will look like they're actually falling out of the inner wall structure of the facility rather than just cluttering up the space right from the get-go. I mean, again, we don't want these interactable objects all littering up the space right from the moment the player steps into the chamber, because it's a sensory overload. We don't want them to think, oh, do I do this? Do I do that? What do I do? So we slowly, gradually reveal each and every challenge one by one. And of course, that means that we have to somehow hide them or make them despawn or not spawn in the first place until they are needed. Around this point, I want to take a bit of a detour and create the sound effects for the generator being turned on. I had somebody in the chat during a live stream mention that I should probably implement some sound effects for the generators, for the steps of the characters, jumps and whatnot. And I figured, you know what? It was probably about the end of the stream or something, so I figured, why not? Let's put in the sound of the generators. And there were two sounds involved. There's the sound of the generator being revved up, and of course the sound of the generator machinery actively operating.
I told you would find the phase gate here. Okay, great. How are we gonna operate it, genius? It's fine, we'll just improvise. I saw Adam trick one of these things into gating us outside the facility. We'll be fine.
Are you completely insane? You're gonna get us killed!
You got any better?
Provided in this showcase the sounds are a little too loud, we end up fixing that later, but hey, it is what it is. Since I was on the subject of generators, I actually ended up getting an idea for how to represent how revved up the generator is without using pop-up user interface that kind of clutters up the screen. So I ended up creating this little black screen, this black monitor, that depicts how spun up the generator is at that time. And this meant that this particular heads up would be displayed all the time. You would constantly know how revved up the generator is, and you would see from the distance if you need to run up to it and address it. Whereas before, the only way to actually see that would be to actually run up to the generator, hover over it or collide with it, and force the pop-up to appear. Again, this is all about communication. You have to communicate to the player what the state of the generator is so that they would make a decision of whether or not they need to run over there and deal with it. It is the same reason why I programmed the overheating indicator on the briefcase to appear above the briefcase, but if the briefcase is off screen, the indicator would actually snap to the edge of the screen. So even if the briefcase is off screen, you would still know if it's being overheated at any point in time and make a decision if you want to run up to it and dunk it into another pool of water, or if you think you have enough time to maybe do something else in the meantime. Now then, while testing the interaction between the generator and the various plasma orbs that you're supposed to deliver, I actually discovered a very annoying quirk of the control system, and it is the fact that because the generator and the plasma orbs are both interacted with the same key, if you happen to be next to the generator with the intent of interacting with the generator, but it just so happens that a plasma orb was nearby, you would end up picking up the plasma orb. And that turned out to be an extremely annoying occurrence, especially when you're rushing to keep up good time, to get all the generators up and running, all revved up at the same time. You cannot afford to lose even a few seconds of nonsense because a plasma orb happened to have landed next to you and you ended up picking it back up. So what I had done is I had segregated the interaction and grabbing inputs. So now to grab something, use one key, and to interact with something, use another key. And technically, this now means that if you have an interactable object, which isn't necessarily have to be a generator, and also a grabbable object like a briefcase or some sort of a piece of device you have to transfer between levels, both of those could be interacted with up to your discretion. So that was, I think, a very important point, and I completely caught that by fluke. I think somebody else who would be playing the game would have probably come across that and complained about it, that it just makes for a very annoying interaction. So thankfully, I have happened to discover this by myself. I am weary of adding additional keys to an already, well, I wouldn't say cluttered input map. Technically, all you can do is run left, right, jump, sprint, and interact. So I guess grabbing something with an extra key shouldn't be a problem. Technically, we still need to be able to revive a player, so that's one less key we can use for revival, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Another particular observation I made when playtesting this level was the fact that if you ever miss a particular task, like for example, if you could forget about the fact that you have to keep the briefcase cool, or the generators under a sprinkler, or any other number of tasks that you're supposed to be taking care of, and failed the level because of that, you tend to not really know what was the reason why you failed. So it's just a game over screen. It doesn't really tell you why you failed. So if you forgot to keep an eye on the briefcase, then maybe the fail screen should tell you you failed because you forgot to keep an eye on the briefcase, or the briefcase overheated. So I went ahead and added an additional label into the end screen, and basically told every object in the game that is capable of, say, killing the player or causing the end game to also supply the reason why the game has ended, why the game over screen appeared. And it's one of those things that I didn't even know I needed until I had it. Because during testing, there have been multiple occasions when a game over screen would appear, but I would ponder on what exactly did I forget to do. Granted, there aren't really too many things that can end a screen here, but still, knowing the reason for failure is a good way to improve on that failure. Continuing down the script, the next event that's supposed to happen is, well, the teleporter is actually supposed to come online. When all of the necessary prerequisites have been fulfilled, the generators have been turned on, they've been on consecutively for the fill bar to fill up, the orbs have been delivered, and the 3 pipes have been connected, at which point the teleporter in the middle of the level would become online, and I had to come up with some sort of a visual representation telling the players that the teleporter is now on and you can use it. Although technically in this case, when the teleporter becomes on, due to the reckless approach that my character took to get it enabled, the teleporter blows up, explodes, and we ended up getting transported to an unknown part of this island. Nevertheless, there should be some sort of visual representation that the teleporter is now online. And of course, in the very beginning of the level, the characters say, we need to enable the phase gate. It is right here, we just need to get it up and running. Simply speaking, it's pretty much just a straight beam going down into the ground, except for the fact that in this case, the teleport was actually at an angle. So in order for me to get the beam to reach the ground, I had to create the beam using a polygon, and I used 2 ray casts on either side of the polygon shooting down at the ground, which would allow me to acquire the coordinates of where the 2 bottom corners of this beam were supposed to touch the ground, so that even if I position this teleporter at an angle, I could still make it look like the beam is landing perfectly on the floor.
Okay, here we go. Get ready.
Stop! This isn't the way to do it. Just let me figure this.
Of course, at the very moment Tim's character says, just let me figure this out, he's supposed to be cut off by an explosion of the teleporter, which fades the whole screen to white, and we finally get to take a break from the intense introduction of this level and be fed the necessary exposition to make sure the story that we're playing makes sense. So, the final component of this entire level is to make the explosion. And for now, what I wanted to start with is the shockwave emanating from the middle of the teleport. So to achieve that, what I decided to do is make a texture that starts with the middle gray, and it's a radial gradient going to white and then back to gray. This gradient simply had to be placed into the shader and be told to offset a pixel in a positive or negative direction based on the orientation of that pixel. Now, I figured this might have to be a screen-wide effect, but thankfully in Godot you can just apply a shader to the sprite and then tell that sprite to read the screen data and simply offset the pixels of the screen data rather than doing the full screen shader. And of course, because I'm projecting that I will probably want to be using this shader, this explosion, this shockwave effect in other places in the game, I decided to make it into a separate scene and simply spawn it at the same time when the explosion takes place. Needless to say, I would argue that the effect turned out better than I expected. And finally, we are done with this introductory level. This took a monumental amount of time to achieve, but to be fair, this one single scene included just about every major function, every major feature in this game. I have no idea what it is that I've been busy with in the previous month of working on this, but I think most of the time was taken up by setting up tiles, tile design, sprites, level props. I think it was mostly artistic work rather than functional. So yeah, this one single scene actually includes all the major components that the entire game is going to be using. Object grabbing, dialogue systems, some particle effects, modular triggerable tasks that the players would have to fulfill in a particular level before the dialogue can move forward. It's just mind-boggling how much work went into this one single scene. And yes, of course, technically it's not one single scene, since these mechanics will be used in all sorts of other scenes. But yeah, we finally reached the finishing line for, I think, the baseline mechanics. So all that was left to do was to trigger that explosion, fade the screen to white, and make a title appear that says 12 hours earlier, 10 hours earlier, so that we can put a little bit of an expositionary piece of information to this tale. So finally, we were now creating a new scene to get our characters to appear there and proceed with the story. I gotta tell you, I was getting kind of borderline sick of that previous scene just because of how much time I spent in it. But yeah, feels like things are moving forward. Okay, this is all the progress that we have made on the RTAG Rise project. There is just one more project that I want to talk to you about, and that is Dreadtail. Let's move on. That weird wobbling enemy that we've been working for the past few episodes finally is going to get some vocalizations. Now, this is pretty much just me kind of hargling and gurgling into the microphone, trying to make some strange, weird, disgusting sounds. For the most part, I needed something fairly simple. I needed some sort of an idle sound that the players can use to navigate to where the enemy is while they can't see it in the fog. There has to be an active attack sound. So this is when the enemy sees you and it's trying to run up to you to perform an attack. And we need some sort of a death sound, which will take place when you flash the enemy with a flashbang. Especially for the idle sound, I've recorded multiple takes, so multiple versions of the sound, and we're going to be using the round ribbon effect to randomly switch between these sounds so that it's not just the same clip played over and over again. You're going to be able to hear these sounds later on in the presentation. Of course, for the model of the enemy itself, I tried to go for some sort of a weird suspended head on a bunch of vine limbs, like something that attempted to mimic a human but failed severely at it. These enemies are the result of a catastrophe that took place on Earth that wiped out most of the human population, and the player will be able to learn about them by picking up some scattered notes throughout the randomly generated forest. Of course, there isn't necessarily a way to guarantee that because the forest is randomly generated and not everybody's going to be out searching for these notes. So I suppose the lore would be more revealed to those who seek it. We technically already have another one of these models, but that one doesn't have a humanoid head. It's the one that keeps appearing behind us on a timed interval. Since we're going to be worrying about enemy navigation, I figured I might as well just give this character a walk cycle and a small idle animation, and work with that from the get-go. I gotta say, it is kind of challenging to make a walk cycle that looks menacing rather than goofy. I thought that speeding up the walk cycle to make it take steps faster might actually turn out to be quite creepy, but maybe I did something wrong, because it looks more goofy than anything. It could technically be the contrast between the character walking slowly and then suddenly speeding up towards you. Now that I think about it, I might want to experiment with that. The next step would be to set up the enemy object in Godot, and the general approach that I usually like to take for enemies is to set up some sort of a parent script that effectively handles all the generic stuff like navigating the world, traversing past obstacles, attacking the player, detecting the player, using raycasts to check line of sight, handling things like losing player if the player walks far enough away, essentially moving between the various game states that the enemy would be in. A lot of these states would be pretty much shared between different types of enemies. So if you have a lot of enemies planned in your game, then why should you really reprogram the navigation code for each and every one of them from scratch? So this is why I usually have all of the general behavior that would be found in every enemy type inside of a generic enemy NPC script. And then every other enemy that I create that has custom behaviors simply will be extending the script with additional features. And that's an actual feature that you can take advantage of in Godot Engine. You can have one script extend the functionality of another script, which effectively behaves as if you had copied and pasted all the code from the master script or the parent script into the inherited one, but you gain the ability to add on top of that functionality additional behaviors and additional code that wouldn't be found in every enemy and is only relevant to a particular enemy type. It's probably become my favorite approach to handling NPCs because, well, a lot of them really do use the same navigational techniques. All I have to do is just replace things like sound effects in the inherited script, swap them out for whatever relevant sounds to be played by that particular enemy, and that's it. The next point of trouble in this project was to get the enemies to be able to walk into these buildings. Now, the problem is that these buildings aren't actually placed in the level editor. These are randomly scattered throughout the level when the game launches. So because of that, I can't really bake the navigation mesh in the editor because, well, the object may not be there anymore, like this church over here. What I needed to do is figure out a way to get the church to have its own navigation and the world to have its own navigation, and have the enemies switch between which navigation node they use to traverse. Now, this was a big pain in the butt to try to figure out and try to set up. I eventually did make it work, where when the enemy approaches the steps of the church, the enemy would collide with an area node, and then that area node basically dictates, hey, you're supposed to be using now the navigation node of the church, and that navigation node has all of the navigation data you need in order to traverse the steps, to go around corners, to pass through that doorway. And of course, when the player steps outside the church, I would program the NPC to head back towards the staircase, at which point they would exit the area node and they would be told to use the world navigation node again, and they would start using that to navigate to the player. Of course, the biggest problem was the randomly placed objects in the world would not be accounted for in the navigation data, which means that the enemies would think that they can just phase right through the building. And this was me using the original navigation system, the navigation resources available in Godot, which didn't really have any collision avoidance implementations in them. Of course, since then, the fine contributors at the Godot project have brought forth a whole new navigation system, which now does have obstacle detection and avoidance system in place. So technically, with this new navigation system and this extremely jank level workaround with multiple navigation nodes, I would make the enemies go in and out of the buildings, but it was such a strange solution. The most optimal thing would have been to get Godot Engine to generate the navigation mesh in real time at the beginning of the level, but I couldn't find such functionality in its navigation server. I've spent the next little while trying to optimize the navigation mesh properties. I wanted to get the NPCs the largest range of motion and make sure they don't get stuck on corners and they can actually traverse things like staircases. And because of the way the church object specifically was built, there could be potentially cases where the enemies would end up climbing on the railings of the staircases where they technically should not be. So one way to fix this was to place some invisible static body nodes that force the navigation mesh to not consider those surfaces walkable, and then in the ready function of the script to simply destroy those static bodies so that the player could walk there. I've also proceeded with the programming of the navigation code for the NPC, and for now I was using the original navigation system. One way I like to debug the navigation code for the enemies is to create a little scene which essentially contains a flag, and I use glowy materials on it so that I can see it in the dark, and anytime an NPC generates a new path to the player, I would simply spawn a flag at each and every single one of those positions that are being returned by the path generator. So this allows me to visually represent where the NPC is going to go and how they're treating other objects that they're supposed to walk around. And it just really makes it a lot easier to debug navigation issues. I never thought I would really think like this, but every time I remake the navigation system, it does indeed get easier and easier to make it larger, make it more complex, make it more considerate, and add additional features. I remember the time when even the thought of AI navigation with nav meshes was just this ambiguous idea that I just did not even think I could handle myself. AI by itself felt like a huge undertaking at the time as well, but now that I get to experiment with the individual components, it really seems like it's just a lot of small systems coming together. So here's what we have so far for this enemy with the sounds and the starting points of the navigation system included. It was around this time when I started encountering some very weird performance issues, and it was always happening when I would reach this one particular place in the level. In the following few sessions on this project, this problem would prove to be quite a thorn in my side. So for the next little bit, I end up spending an entire session trying to gather some information of what could be possibly happening in that particular spot on the map that causes the performance to basically tank to unacceptable levels. At first I was thinking that maybe it has something to do with the amount of trees being spawned or becoming visible at that particular point. I tried to decrease the visibility range, I tried reducing the range of the area node, which is detecting those trees. It only really improved the performance a little bit, but it was nowhere near enough to warrant that to be a fix. I mean, when I step out of the church, the performance is perfectly fine. But when I reach this particular point, it starts to tank heavily. So a few small trees being enabled is not going to be the cause of this issue. There is got to be something else happening in the background. And it took me a long time of just walking around trying to pinpoint exact location where this issue takes place. I tried removing the surrounding props because they did have some interactable components in them. I figured maybe it's the code within those components that's causing the issue. And again, the performance gain was pretty negligible, so it definitely can't be any of those props. Sometimes you just hit one of those debugging issues that takes forever to figure out. The weirdest thing is that the performance hit wasn't as bad as when an enemy was chasing me in this area, so I figured, okay, so the enemy might have something inside of it that is contributing to the performance loss, and maybe the player has something inside of it that does the same. And sometimes when you hit one of these issues, you can't figure it out right away. You just have to try to maybe leave it by itself and then come back to it later on and see if you can spot it from a new angle. I tried consulting the Godot subreddit to see if somebody had some suggestions. I was recommended to try to use the profiler in order to see what types of processes are taking up the most performance. The problem is that the profiler gives you all these different values, like how long did the frame take to render, how long did the physics process take to run its code, how long did your main process run, how many signals were executed. The problem is that for somebody who's never used a profiler before, these numbers literally say nothing, because I don't know what is a normal average expectancy for any of these values supposed to be. So if I'm looking at a value, how should I know if it's good or bad? So I tried walking around the level in debugging view, seeing which objects appear, which objects disappear, seeing which collisions appear. But in the end, I decided to just kind of leave it on the side and come back to it when I had a fresh set of ideas. The next session, I decided to take a moment to experiment with the effects chain in the audio processor in Godot. I wanted to give the enemy a bit of an echoey feel to their sounds, so that it actually sounds like they are producing an echo in this large, vast forest with their grunts. And the effect that actually made it all work would be the delay effect, which is effectively produces an echo over a particular time span, and you can set how much echo gets returned before it dissipates to nothing. This actually produced a very almost horror, nightmarish, fairy tale type of vibe to the sound effects. I mean, first of all, when you use delays, it automatically adds a little bit of space to the sound. So it actually sounded like the enemy wasn't right next to your ear, and instead the sound had a particular distance to it when it had to echo. Another good effect that you can use is reverb, which adds a bit of a reverberation, reflection to your sounds, which is a good way to define what kind of space you're currently navigating sonically. Yeah, there we go. Should be able to walk up to him if we could keep ourselves concealed. Jesus. Now, something that I've been putting on the side for far too long is the actual ability to fight against these enemies. So I thought it was about high time I've taken care of that mechanic. The player has a flashbang in their arsenal, which is an electronic flashbang. It uses a battery, flash bulb, capacitor, and a tin can in order to put one together. Actually, it also uses wire. So when you're crafting it, you have to have all those components in your inventory to be able to handle these enemies. So what I was thinking is the player has to point the flashbang at the enemy, pull the trigger, and the flash would quite literally petrify the enemy in place, solidifying them in whatever pose they were when they were chasing the player. At that point, I figured it might also be fun if the player had to then whack the enemy with a sledgehammer in order to destroy it completely. Otherwise, it had a chance of coming back. So when the enemy gets petrified, I wanted it to be a less menacing form than the one that actually chases you. And the reason being is because I wanted to keep a sense of mystery around the visual presentation of these enemies, so that you don't use the flashbang on the enemy and then you could just freely walk up to it and inspect all the nooks and crannies and take a good long look up close to what the enemy looks like in complete safety. there's a quirk that I figured I might be able to employ here, where when the enemy gets petrified, it actually assumes a much less representative form of its actual living part. So what I did is create a low poly alternative of the main mesh by simply subdividing it to the point where all the facial features would disappear. And once the player flashbangs this enemy, I simply hide the original higher polygon mesh, well, as high as, you know, the hand modeling goes, and simply substitute it with displaying the low polygon mesh. Now, here's the interesting part. Because the low polygon mesh and the high polygon mesh are within the same GLTF file, I can talk to them freely without really needing to import them separately. And the low polygon mesh actually is still bound to all the bones of the armature of the enemy, which means whatever position I pause the animation in for the enemy's run cycle, the low poly mesh will assume the same exact pose. So it quite literally looks like they're just being petrified in whatever pose they were when they were chasing the player. I think it's a lot creepier when he's just unexpectedly appears. I want to be slick. Come on, come on. So as you can see, we've piggybacked off of the functionality of us being able to pin the flashbang onto any surface and point it into just about any direction. I continued experimenting with the navigation of the NPC, trying to get them to swiftly or smoothly navigate in and out of the church, being able to detect if the player's in the church or outside the church so they can properly navigate out of the building. The player has a lot wider range of movement because they can jump out the window, they can jump out of these holes in the walls, but the enemy has to go the long way around. And I really don't want the player to learn that as an exploit, so they could just keep jumping in and out of the window and just the enemy is basically going to be practically neutralized at that point. I honestly find it most immersion breaking when players figure out an exploit that they can cheese to get the enemy to just not get to them. And it's going to be a very difficult thing to try to deal with. Different developers treat this issue in different ways. For example, in Fallout, I've noticed that NPCs tend to run away and hide in areas that are out of the player's sight until the player decides to step off of whatever hard-to-reach or impossible-to-reach place, like a bookshelf or a cabinet or a car or top of the building. And it's not until the player actually lands on the ground and the enemy is capable of producing a working navigation path to them is when they come out of hiding and start chasing the player again. But if I go for that particular system, that gives the player an unfair advantage of just being able to climb on some sort of a tree or climb on some sort of a prop, and the enemy is unable to get them, and suddenly, well, the player has a very advantageous tool to basically nullify enemies' behavior. Another way to treat it is to give the enemies a ranged attack, which would only come into play if the player happens to be in an out of reach place for a melee attack. And of course, if the player starts cheesing the system by entering and exiting certain locations that make the enemy have to go the long way around to exit, then we could have the enemy maybe like dig a hole in the ground and then pop out right next to the player, which is something that the mole rats are doing in the Fallout series. They will dig themselves into the ground if the player puts too much distance between them and just pop out right next to the player. And yes, it's kind of a cheap solution, but to be honest, when I'm playing Fallout and the mole rat actually digs itself into the ground, I start freaking out because it can pop up literally anywhere. And I think that effect could be emphasized by putting a nice long pause between the enemy digging itself into the ground and then popping back out. You know it's going to come back out, so waiting for that to happen is pretty suspenseful. I continued my struggle in learning the various nooks and crannies and features of the navigation mesh generator, and at that point I noticed that I'm hitting consistently this particular error with the navigation mesh, which essentially says that it had failed to merge two or more edges together. Now, I figured that, okay, maybe it's the navigation mesh of the church and the navigation mesh of the world, the terrain, not really contacting well together, or, well, misbehaving effectively. So I figured, okay, it says that in both navigation mesh instances, a certain parameter called cell size is supposed to match. Otherwise, Godot Engine will have a hard time merging those together. But no matter how much I tried to adjust the parameter, it just would not fix. And as far as I know, this error was the red error, which means that it would crash the game when we try to export it. It doesn't crash it in the editor, but it would be an issue that has to be resolved if I want to be able to compile this game. You see, in Godot Engine, any error that marked in red that doesn't outright crash your game will technically crash the game when it's exported as a final binary. So I had to figure out a way to fix this. Unfortunately, no matter what properties I tried to change, no matter what I tried to do, it would not go away. So then I figured, okay, why don't we get rid of the navigation mesh instance entirely? As a matter of fact, why don't we just unload the whole church? And that's when I realized that this error has nothing to do with the two navigation meshes not contacting one another. It is quite literally the entire navigation mesh created on the terrain alone having some sort of a bug in it that made a couple of surfaces not connect well together. So I haven't tested yet what happens if I try to export this game as a final binary. Maybe that particular error wouldn't cause an issue, because the enemies still navigate the terrain just fine. So maybe I can just keep it, right? It's not presenting functional problems. So if Godot Engine will allow me to run this application and standalone with that error in place, then, well, I don't see a problem. But that is something I have yet to test. On the side note, when I was trying to debug the navigation mesh data while viewing the navigation data live in the game, it actually produced a very peculiar effect. I like this. This looks really interesting. So it's time to switch gears a little bit. This enemy that has just popped up behind me doesn't have any animations, so I figured maybe it's about time I address that. He's supposed to have a regular walk cycle chasing the player. He's only supposed to chase the player when the player sees it. So that's the one particular differentiation between the behavior of this enemy and the other one that sounds like a whiny bitch. And yes, those whiny voices are indeed mine. No relation. So I went ahead and rigged up this character's model and gave him its own walk cycle animation. I do want to make sure that I differentiate between different enemy classes, because I don't want it to just be another version of the same exact enemy that already chases us. As a matter of fact, one of the ideas I had was to make this enemy look a lot more like a rotten tree stump, and if the player decides to approach it, it actually stands up and starts chasing him. It's one of the mechanics I wanted to explore in this game, where a tree could just be a tree, or a tree stump could just be a tree stump, or it could be an enemy mimicking as one. Next, I decided to switch gears for a little bit and work on a particular effect that I wanted the enemies to produce on the screen of the player. So what I wanted to do is make the enemies distort the vision, specifically around the spot of the enemy on the screen. And the way I was going to achieve this is by drawing a rectangle on top of the player's view, and then drawing to that rectangle the rendered result of the gameplay. then that basically became a texture which I could distort with, well, whatever it is I wanted to distort it with. So now it was time to make the enemies actually distort the portion of the screen that they occupied. And the way I achieved that is by producing a new viewport, which would be filled with a middle gray color, and the enemies would be unprojecting their three-dimensional position onto the two-dimensional space of the viewport, and essentially placing and moving a couple of darker gray or lighter gray rectangles. So effectively that viewport would contain a middle gray fill, and then anytime an enemy would appear on the screen, there would be a number of these brighter rectangles hovering in the general vicinity of the enemy. So that viewport essentially became my pixel offset texture. What I would do is go into the shader that is the rectangle covering the entire screen that we discussed earlier, and then in the visual shader I would take the viewport texture as a secondary texture and use the pixel data in that viewport texture to offset the pixels of the gameplay. You basically take the entire rendered frame, which is available to you as a screen space texture in the visual shader, and then simply offset the pixels by the RGB amount of that viewport texture, which means since the viewport texture is middle gray is technically a value of 0.5. Black is 0, 1 is white, so gray is 0.5. Now, if you then use vector math to subtract 0.5 from the texture, that means that middle gray becomes 0. And now you can use that 0 to offset the pixels in whatever direction you want. So if the color gets slightly darker, that becomes negative 0.5. It becomes brighter, it becomes positive 0.5. And I gotta say, this is actually the reason why I really like the visual shader mechanic in Godot Engine rather than using coded shaders. Visual shader is perhaps the only time I will find a node-based system, node-based programming system, acceptable. Because with visual shaders, you can have a direct preview of each and every single stage of your effect rather than only being able to witness the final effect in a coded shader and having to swap out what gets rendered to the output to be able to test various things. And at this point, we finally reached the moment where the enemy had to be programmed to be spawned. Now, the way I wanted to handle the spawning for this particular enemy is to make it be spawned out of sight behind trees. So essentially, the system would require me to assemble a list of all the trees that are surrounding the player, then choose one of those trees at random, project a ray or a vector so that the enemy would be perfectly hidden behind the tree trunk, then make the enemy spawn and make sure that no part of the enemy is actually visible. I've achieved that by having a number of raycasts within the enemy constantly check for their line of sight with the player's camera collision shape. Now, as long as all of the raycasts were not visible, all of the raycasts were colliding with something else besides the player camera, this meant that the enemy was out of sight. And I had 4 of these raycasts placed on the outer edges of the legs and the outer edges of the arms to make sure that it covered the entire body volume. So the enemy simply constantly checked for the collision with the player camera little area node that was meant specifically for checking line of sight, and as long as none of those raycasts were colliding, the enemy was reporting as being hidden. So then it was just a matter of spawning the enemy and then removing those raycasts because they have served their purpose and we do not need them hogging up our performance. And that is how we managed to make our enemies spawn behind trees while being out of sight. So now you'll have this occurrence while you're walking through the forest and you kind of visibly see that there might be nothing behind a tree, but you continue walking and suddenly does appear behind that tree. And I imagine this effect might be more emphasized when the player is walking besides a bunch of trees and they can visibly see that the tree they just passed that had nothing behind it at one angle now has an enemy standing on the other side. This is where the issue with performance really started creeping up. And the weirdest part is that in this case, the more enemies popped into the level, the worse the performance got. So it was about time I started trying to address this issue. It took some debugging, but in the end, I did figure out who the culprit is. You see, the culprit was the interaction between the terrain node, which is a plugin made by Zillen, and the area node inside of the enemy and the player. Now, this is an issue that I have experienced before, I have discovered before, and I have fixed before, but every damn time I forget about it. And here's the nature of the issue. The terrain that Zillen had made is dynamic. It actually reduces its resolution as the distance gets further and further, and that makes sense. You don't want the resolution of the terrain at full length, at full quality across all of the distances in a game that has a lot of terrain or a lot of walkable area. So my speculation is that because the terrain dynamically resizes itself, which means that the collision has to also be dynamically resized, that makes the collision effectively be made out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small, tiny triangles. Now, in order for the player and other kinematic bodies and rigid bodies in this game to collide with the terrain instead of falling through it, they have to be able to detect those triangles, which means those triangles must be a part of a static body node. And the player and the enemies have area nodes inside of them which are capable of detecting static bodies, rigid bodies, and kinematic bodies. So if your terrain is made out of hundreds of little triangles, the area node will treat each and every one of those triangles as an individual collision shape. That's hundreds of collision shapes entering and exiting an area node at all times. And the area node has signals inside of it. It is capable of reporting anytime a single new collision shape enters and exits its region of detection. So every time the player and a whole bunch of enemies were traversing the terrain, their area nodes were reporting each and every tiny triangle entering and exiting. And that is what was causing the performance issues. The solution to this problem was to make the area nodes to ignore the collisions of the terrain. So I've done that by simply making the area nodes be on a different collision layer than the terrain, and then immediately the performance issues had gone away. Now, before I figured this out, I was experimenting with some really weird solutions. Like, I was thinking, okay, we have a lot of raycasts here. Like, they're doing a lot of raycast calculations. Maybe that's the problem. I'm calculating these raycasts in the physics process, and the physics process runs 90 times per second. So these raycasts are performing their collisions 90 times per second. Now we have a bunch of enemies here. Okay, so enemies, well, we got 5 enemies, so there's 5 raycasts, and all of them are running at 90 times per second. Maybe that is the cause of the problem. So what I started doing is I figured, okay, maybe the raycasts don't need to run as often as they do. So let's put them on some sort of a timer, maybe a fifth of a second. So now, instead of 90 times per second, the raycasts would only run their code maybe a quarter of a second or half a second. And it was actually fixing the performance issues to the point where I considered that to be the fix, and I consider that to be the cause of the problem. But in reality, it was the area nodes interacting with the terrain in a way that was just flooding the physics process with all these signals. Now, on the side note, this got me thinking that the Godot engine has process function, which runs as fast as the renderer lets it. It has physics process function, which runs at the speed of the physics engine, which is 90 times per second. So I figured, maybe there should be another process function that is specifically meant for logic. The kind of function that doesn't need to run as often as 90 times per second. Maybe this is where you put some logic that needs to run every maybe 5 times a second, 10 times a second. And yes, of course, you can set up a timer and you can give it a signal and then put your logic code into that timer. And that's technically what I was doing here in an attempt to fix this. But, maybe it's something to consider for Godot's future. Because some logic really doesn't need to run that often, especially if it's a logic that deals with dictionaries or lists and it has to iterate through them often. The remainder of my development process for this update was to create a bunch of props to populate the world with. Anytime I feel like programming is becoming more of a chore than a fun adventure, I switch to a different aspect of the game, and the modeling seems to be almost therapeutic at this point. It's a highly creative process, and I really enjoy it just for what it is. So one of the props that the player would encounter quite often in this game is a tape reel recorder or player. The entire backstory of this game that the player will be uncovering is distributed between multiple means of delivery, which are terminal records, text records on computers, and voice recordings on tape reels. So I decided to put together a quick tape reel and tape player so that I could start experimenting with getting some voice actors on Fiverr to voice over some expositionary information, get the story moving forward, and the player would be able to approach any number of tape players scattered throughout the level, throughout the bunker chunks, and pop in a battery, pop in a tape player, and hear what it has to say. After the tape player, of course, came time for the tape reel itself, and coincidentally, this was around the time when a new Godot Engine update came out, and this update actually included a brand new node called Label 3D, which means that I could texture this tape reel to have a placeholder paper texture, like a paper label, and then the text of the label could be done using this Label 3D node. So that means I did not really have to worry about creating multiple textures, multiple concurrent textures for different labels with different writings on them. Now, of course, I don't have to have any writings on them. I could just have some squiggles on the label to imitate writing and just leave it as it is. But I figured, you know what? It might be good to experiment. And this item is supposed to be an inventory item. You're supposed to be able to place it into the inventory and carry it over to a tape player. So obviously it had to have an item icon. So I had quickly arranged a camera, and then I realized, you know what? If I'm making an icon, I might as well make an icon that's going to be final and I'm just going to be using in the game. So that means the reel needed to be textured before I actually produce the icon. Speaking of texturing, I hear that Substance Painter is going to be taken off Steam by Adobe. Well, it's a big surprise that is. So, yeah, you got some time to buy a license as far as I am aware, because it's an amazing piece of software, and it sucks that Adobe had acquired it, because Adobe are a bunch of dicks. Since I started touching on the narrative delivery of the game, I had to figure out the entire story as a whole. So I've been using Trello in order to write down all the ideas for all the characters, all their plot lines, and the list of obstacles and resolutions that the player has to overcome in order to complete the whole story. However, this is one of those games where multiple things have to come together in order for a particular solution to be realized. In the simplest of examples, in order for you to, for example, open up a particular cabinet, you have to locate the key, you have to oil the hinges, and you have to get some sort of a pry tool. Now, each one of those objects has its own chain of events that you have to execute in order to acquire it. So to get the key, you have to locate the body of the scientist who had the key. In order to locate the scientist, you have to use some sort of radio communications device. But that radio communications device is locked behind an encryption key, so now you have to locate the encryption key. So the gameplay consists of a series of obstacles that the player has to overcome in a creative fashion in order to achieve their end goal. And the problem is that the Trello's one-dimensional arrangement approach makes that kind of difficult to manage. There are certain goals that loop back on themselves or depend on other goals located in a completely unrelated part of the list. So what I've decided to do is migrate the entire story and the entire obstacle and resolution scheme into our own tool, which is actually part of our scriptwriter's tool bag called Siren. I did mention this tool before. It's essentially a project that my father and I are cooking up together. My father is a scriptwriter, so this creation is pretty much all of his work, and I'm executing the programming side of it. So what you see in front of you is one of several tools that you have access to analyze your narratives. Now, I'm using this in order to plot out the entire story in a two-dimensional graph. In nature, this particular tool is meant to be used as an analytical tool to develop the histories and analyze the causations of your characters and events. which makes it a perfect tool to lay down the gameplay loop and outline the end goal and all the requirements that need to be met to achieve that goal. Now, not only have I outlined the list of objectives and subjects, I've also outlined the order in which the story unwraps itself. And this gives me an opportunity to figure out in what order am I going to tell the story. Now, this game has to have a lot of things come together in order for the player to figure out the end goal. However, the story has to be told in a particular order. So unlike in, say, Outer Wilds, where the story could literally begin from just about any point you'd like, and you can just explore it like a web in any direction, in this particular case, the narrative has a particular order in which it has to be explained. So by plucking down the entire story and objectives onto this graph, I can start thinking of how to lock away particular objectives until previous objectives could be achieved, so that the story could also be told in the proper order. Now, because completing the objective usually unlocks the next objective, and that could be quite literally meant that you unlock a particular locked door that gives you a set of clues, these could also be used to lock away parts of the narrative that have to be revealed in a particular order. The next piece of prop I put together is a giant missile silo. So the general lore of the game is the fact that the military installation that was in this swamp before it got blown up had been using a decommissioned missile silo as a containment chamber for a particular object that they have acquired that they've been attempting to do research on. So the player would encounter this missile silo somewhere in the swamp and through a series of puzzles attempt to open it for the purposes of the story that I'm not going to spoil in this video. I noticed that in some of my games I have been dabbling a lot with larger than life sort of scales, where you enter regions of the level or encounter objects that are so inhumanely colossal that it just dwarfs your puny little existence. And I feel like it might tie into my fascination with space horror or cosmic horror subjects, as by the point in the game when the player actually does manage to open the silo, the story, the background story that the player's been discovering should have been well underway. So there should already have been built up enough of an intrigue to want to go in here. Oh, and yeah, looks like I got caught inside of the collision shape of the lid. So now I have to wait for this thing to run the animation loop again and get out of it. Nice. Last but not least, in our adventure of prop making for this game, I decided to put together a server rack, which would be located in multiple destroyed bunker chunks that the player can discover, as well as the surrounding the silo. So this would be all the electronic equipment that is controlling these devices. These would pretty much just be static props. The player's not going to be interacting with them. And I got the idea from the server racks you encounter in Portal 2 when you get a chance to run around their office areas. Now, I wanted to get a good variety of these server racks, and that meant I would have had to do a lot of modeling and a lot of custom assets, and I decided, you know what? Maybe we are going to do procedurally generated server racks. So this would save me a lot of time. It would give me a very large amount of variation, and because of the random algorithm, every time you play the game, the server rack configuration will look different. So what I had done is I modeled the server frame, I then modeled a long server and a short server, and then I modeled a number of small dials, buttons, switches, and other doohickeys that one would find on an old server like this. I have then turned the long server and the short server into scenes, attached the same script to both of them, and within that script I had simply put together a small algorithm that generates a random number of dials and buttons and switches on the front panel, instancing them into place. This has to be done only once in the ready function. And then I programmed the server rack to randomly spawn a number of server units. So it was kind of a nested behavior. The server rack generates the server units, and the server units generates the switches and dials that appear in front of it. For the time being, all of this was done without a texture, but I reckon that I would be able to just texture everything on one single texture page, one single texture file, and everything will just fit in nicely. You have already seen me use this technique back in the Angular discussion part of this video. So yeah, it's a modular, or I guess it would be more random approach to generating your assets, and it really helps to add variety and saves me a lot of time on modeling. So this is going to be it for this video. Holy cow, this actually turned out to be quite a long one, but I did have about 2-3 months of progress to go through, and I really didn't want to make it accumulate even more, so that's why I wanted to get this video out before I moved on to the more game dev. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope to see you in the next episode. Catch the live streams. You can find some of my games on Steam. You can use the link in the bottom left for my studio, quote-unquote studio website, and most of the game links would be located there. You can check out theconceptbay.net, which is the website where all of these production videos, all of the recorded production videos, are going to be available. So stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next video.